Hello, my dear friends. They painted poison on their faces, rubbed ashes into their skin, and called it beauty. Behind lace and perfume, decay hid quietly, disguised as grace. Every layer of powder told a secret about pain, control, and the fear of being seen. What if elegance was never clean, and purity was only a performance? Tonight, we return to the world where beauty was born from dirt, and the women who paid the price for it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now we dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step into a Victorian drawing room, the first thing to notice would not be the furniture or the lace curtains, but the faces. Pale, almost ghostly faces that seemed untouched by the sun, smooth as porcelain yet lifeless in their perfection. This whiteness was not a gift of nature but a creation of poison. The women of the time believed that true beauty meant looking delicate, fragile, and untouched by labour or the outdoors. To achieve that illusion, they turned to powders made of white lead. It was dusted across the cheeks and forehead each morning, giving the skin a cold, even glow that looked pure under candlelight. The irony was that the same substance that made them appear alive in society was quietly killing them beneath the surface. The lead sank into pores and blood, dulling the senses and sapping the body of strength. At first, it caused a gentle tingling on the skin, a small irritation easily ignored. Over time, hair began to fall out in clumps, vision blurred, and fatigue became constant. Yet even as their bodies failed, women continued to coat their faces. It is almost darkly funny how suffering was painted over with a layer of powder and called elegance. Servants helped their mistresses apply the toxic paste carefully, often mixing it with vinegar or egg white for a smoother finish. It hardened like plaster, sealing the skin until it cracked at the corners of the mouth. Beneath the powder, sores grew unnoticed. When they did appear, more paint was added to hide them. In portraits of the era, this style became immortalized. Artists captured the pale faces as signs of virtue and refinement. The glow of lead was mistaken for purity. In crowded salons, women competed not through charm but through the brightness of their skin. A whiter face meant higher standing. The absurdity of it was rarely questioned. Doctors knew the dangers of lead, but few dared to criticize fashion. Beauty, after all, was considered a moral duty. A healthy flush was seen as vulgar, something belonging to maids or farm girls. Women who appeared too lively were said to lack dignity. The perfect lady looked half dead, and that was the point. Even poorer women imitated the style as best they could. Small tins of whitening powder were sold cheaply in markets, mixed with chalk or flour when real lead was too costly. Mothers taught daughters how to apply it evenly, pressing it gently around the nose and chin. The powder left streaks on collars and handkerchiefs, but that too was considered a mark of refinement. If this happened today, it would be like people proudly wearing a cream made of battery acid just because an influencer said it made their skin glow. The blindness of the era came not only from ignorance but from pride. Pale skin symbolized class, restraint, and femininity. It was worth any sacrifice, even sight and sanity. Something was haunting about how normal it all seemed. Women gathered before mirrors, dusting poison onto their faces while chatting about the weather or dinner. Their fingers left white prints on glass and doorknobs. The scent of vinegar filled the air, sharp and metallic. Powder drifted through the rooms like smoke, settling on every surface. Husbands praised their wives' delicate beauty, unaware that each compliment celebrated decay. The powder did not just stay on the skin. It crept into the lungs with every breath. into the bloodstream with every application. Children hugged their mothers and inhaled traces of it too. Behind the elegance lay quiet desperation. The Victorian woman lived in a world that demanded perfection but offered no mercy. Her appearance was her currency, her armour, and her prison. Each morning began with the same ritual of self-erasure. To be admired meant to look unnatural, and to look unnatural required pain. Something is unsettling in how easily beauty becomes a kind of slow suicide when society calls it grace. Even when reformers began to speak out, few listened. Advertisements promised safe powders and improved creams, but nearly all contained the same deadly base. The more danger was revealed, the more demand grew. Death itself could not compete with fashion. In letters and diaries, traces of awareness appear. Some women confessed to headaches and trembling hands. Others wrote of fear that their faces might crack or discolour during gatherings. Still, they returned to the mirror each day. Vanity was not a flaw, but a requirement. In a world where women had little power, appearance was one of the few ways to command respect. The pale mask was a uniform, a sign of belonging to a certain class. It could not be abandoned, no matter the cost. Beneath it, real faces aged faster, grew thinner, and lost their colour entirely. The contradiction between purity and poison defined the beauty ideals of the time. Lead made the skin smooth and lifeless, the same qualities admired in marble statues. Society loved women who looked like art, not flesh. And so, they became statues in motion, slowly crumbling under the weight of their own perfection. The industry thrived on this illusion, selling death in small jars wrapped in elegance. When symptoms worsened, women were told to rest, to drink tonics, or to pray. The idea that their beauty products were the cause was too terrible to face. In the dim light of Victorian bedrooms, mirrors reflected not just faces but the cost of their glow. Powder cracked at the edges, revealing grey, tired skin beneath. Yet even that glimpse of truth was quickly covered again. Clean hands dipped into powder boxes, brushing away the evidence. It was a ritual of control in a world that offered none. Outside, the city burned coal. The air was thick with soot, and disease lingered in the fog. The white face, however unnatural, stood out like a promise of purity amid the dirt. It was not real, but in that world, reality mattered less than appearance. The white mask of the Victorian woman tells us how beauty can turn against the body that wears it. It speaks of fear, ambition, and the quiet cruelty of standards that reward suffering. Beneath the powder, there was no perfection, only endurance disguised as grace. Her pale face hid pain and pride in equal measure. The powder that once promised purity would soon stain the world with something darker. Somewhere behind those closed doors, another form of beauty was waiting to be born, one that would demand just as much, but in a different way. The shine of Victorian hair was not born from luxury but from grease. Women coated their hair with animal fat, using melted lard or chicken grease to tame the flyaways and create the illusion of smoothness. The scent was thick, clinging to fabrics and air alike. But they called it natural. Servants carried small jars of warm fat from the kitchen to the dressing rooms, where ladies sat before mirrors, waiting for their hair to be dressed. Fingers dipped into the oily mixture, spreading it through every strand until the scalp gleamed. What began as a beauty ritual often ended in discomfort. Dust and soot from the streets clung easily to the sticky surface, turning elegant curls into heavy ropes of dirt by the end of the week. It is almost absurd that the same grease used for cooking meat became a mark of refinement once it touched the head. To make the practice feel gentler, women wrapped their heads in hot towels after applying the fat. They called it nourishing. The heat melted the residue deeper into the roots, making the hair heavy and glossy for days. The sensation was said to be soothing, though the smell lingered long after the towel cooled. In homes without running water, washing hair was a rare luxury. Most preferred to brush the oil through again, spreading it evenly rather than rinsing it out. Hairbrushes with boar bristles were prized possessions, used dozens of times each evening. The repetitive strokes spread the grease, giving the illusion of care. It was a slow ritual, one that made women feel in control of at least one part of their bodies in a world ruled by discomfort. The result was striking from a distance. Under dim candlelight or gas lamps, the shine looked expensive, deliberate, even sensual. Society praised such hair as a sign of good upbringing and self-discipline. To appear too clean was to appear poor, for only servants had time to wash. The rich showed their refinement through maintenance rather than hygiene. If this happened today, it would be like people rubbing bacon grease into their hair because a magazine claimed it brought out natural shine. Cleanliness had little to do with beauty, and women learned to disguise odour with ribbons, scented combs, and sachets pinned inside bonnets. Yet nothing could completely hide the faint rancid smell that came with heat and time. At gatherings, the mixture of perfumes and animal fat filled the air. It mingled with smoke, wool, and sweat, until the whole room smelled faintly of decay masked by sweetness. The wealthy pretended not to notice. They smiled, waved their fans, and complimented each other's appearance. Men admired the glossy curls, unaware that each strand carried traces of kitchen drippings. Hairdressers perfected the technique, blending fat with beeswax to make it more solid, easier to sculpt into elaborate shapes. The famous Victorian waves and rolls owed their smoothness to this concoction, but beneath the style, the scalp suffocated. Pores clogged, infections formed, and hairlines receded slowly with each season. To avoid washing, many relied on powders made from starch or rice. These were sprinkled at the roots, absorbing some of the oil before being brushed out, yet the powder mixed with sweat, forming clumps that itched and flaked. When scratched, the scalp bled easily. Still, the sight of dull powder on dark hair was less offensive than grease, so women alternated between both methods. Hairpins and combs grew crusted with residue, rarely cleaned because water was believed to weaken them. Each piece of grooming equipment carried the smell of its owner, turning personal hygiene into a deeply intimate and often unpleasant signature. The strangest part was how deeply this habit was tied to identity. A woman with shining hair was thought to be disciplined and respectable. Greasy hair, rather than dirty, was considered a mark of careful attention. The logic was reversed. Clean hair meant neglect because it looked unstyled. The true Victorian lady had hair that stayed in place no matter the weather, and animal fat was the secret that made it possible. There is something quietly tragic in how beauty can demand a kind of self-denial that makes the body revolt. When the scalp burned or erupted in sores, doctors prescribed vinegar rinses or herbal tonics, which only added new odours to the mix. Even servants, who handled the greasing of their mistress's hair, followed the same custom in imitation. It was one of the few luxuries they could share. The difference lay only in the quality of fat. While the rich used cleanly rendered lard, the poor reused kitchen drippings, darkened with crumbs and salt. When melted again, it produced a bitter smell, one that never left the hair completely. Yet even that faint gleam was enough to suggest aspiration, a whisper that one belonged to something higher. In the candlelight of cramped rooms, women smiled at their reflections, convincing themselves that the sheen meant beauty. The connection between animal fat and elegance reflected more than vanity. It revealed a society comfortable with contradiction. The same civilization that celebrated moral purity built its beauty on grease and decay. Advertisements praised natural gloss without mentioning its source. Recipes circulated among women's circles, each promising a better blend of oils, waxes, and fats. Even as medical journals began to warn of skin disease, the ritual endured. It was cheaper than imported oils and more reliable than superstition. To stop would have been to risk looking unkempt, and no woman of status could afford that. The hair of the Victorian woman was not simply a style but a statement. It told others that she could afford servants, time, and patience. The gleam was proof of effort, not cleanliness. In portraits, it caught the light, shimmering against dark velvet dresses, but outside the frame, the reality was far less graceful. A damp scalp under layers of fat, the faint itch of trapped heat, the endless brushing to maintain the illusion. The beauty that society admired was born of discomfort and smell, yet it was still called refinement. The shining curls of the Victorian woman were less a sign of health than of endurance. Each strand told a story of effort, imitation, and silent suffering. Somewhere between the glow and the odour lay the truth of what beauty cost in that time. The skin had been poisoned, the hair now suffocated, and the cycle of decay disguised as grace was only deepening. Victorian women often believed that washing their hair too often was a sign of recklessness. They valued restraint, not freshness. Water was seen as both a luxury and a threat, capable of weakening the body or dulling the shine that had been carefully built over time. Instead of washing, women allowed the natural oils from their scalp to accumulate, spreading them through their hair with endless strokes of ivory combs. It was said that the more one brushed, the thicker and glossier the hair became. The truth, however, was less elegant. What they called natural nourishment was, in reality, layers of oil, dust, and soot gathering quietly beneath the surface. It is oddly amusing how neglect was once mistaken for sophistication. Each morning, the same ritual was repeated. A maid stood behind her mistress, patiently drawing a comb through the heavy strands. The sound was soft but constant, a rhythm of vanity and patience. Brushing was not only for beauty but for control. The repetition soothed the nerves, making the act itself feel virtuous. Women believed they were strengthening their hair, making it resistant to damage and time. But as the days turned into weeks, the scalp became sticky, the roots darkened, and the smell of sweat blended with perfume. To hide it, they sprinkled rice powder or scented dust along the parting lines, pressing it gently into the scalp until the hair looked matte and fresh again. From afar, it worked. Up close, the illusion cracked. Hygiene was never the goal. The Victorian idea of grooming was about appearance, not cleanliness. A woman who washed her hair too often risked being seen as careless, perhaps even improper. Clean hair was considered too loose, too soft, lacking the discipline that society demanded. The ideal head of hair looked heavy, composed, almost stiff. A faint scent of musk or rosewater masked the deeper odour underneath. In crowded rooms, everyone smelled the same, a blend of powder, oil, and faint decay. If this existed today, it would be like people proudly avoiding shampoo for months and calling the grease organic volume. The brushes themselves were prized possessions, made from ivory or polished wood, with bristles of boar hair. They were passed down from mother to daughter. Rarely were they cleaned. Dust and flakes from the scalp gathered between the bristles, forming a thin grey film. When used again, this residue was worked back into the hair, a cycle that seemed endless. The maid's task was to brush until her arms ached, ensuring that every strand lay perfectly in place. For many women, this ritual replaced bathing altogether. The smooth surface of the hair was proof enough of refinement, even if beneath the shine lay grime. Advertisements of the time reinforced the illusion. Pamphlets promised tonics that could restore thickness and encourage growth without washing. These mixtures were often made of alcohol, oil, and perfume. Some included arsenic or mercury, believed to purify the scalp. The results were temporary, but the habit persisted. Women mistook the temporary heaviness for strength, unaware that their follicles were suffocating. Doctors who suggested regular washing were dismissed as radicals undermining traditional femininity. The fewer times a woman touched water, the more respectable she appeared. Social gatherings reflected this strange balance between beauty and decay. Under candlelight, hair glistened with the sheen of natural oils, giving faces a soft, glowing frame. Compliments passed easily, and women compared the shine and thickness of their curls as if discussing jewels. No one mentioned the effort it took to maintain that state, the constant brushing, the powders, the towels used to wipe sweat instead of cleansing it. There is something quietly sad in how much energy went into maintaining the illusion of purity without ever feeling clean. Servants, too, absorbed these customs. They brushed their own hair dry, imitating their mistresses, even when their work left them covered in soot and smoke. Clean water was for drinking, not washing. When a rare bath was taken, it was usually for the body alone, never the head. Some even wrapped their hair in cloth during baths to keep it untouched by water. The belief that washing weakened the spirit persisted for generations, passed down as wisdom rather than superstition. The irony was that while they feared illness from water, the lack of it caused infections and disease far more quietly. The powdered scalp became a hidden battlefield. Beneath the surface, small sores appeared, hidden under layers of residue. The scratching from combs opened wounds that refused to heal, yet the brushing continued, relentless and proud. Every stroke reinforced the belief that beauty was control, that suffering was dignity. The faint hiss of the brush moving through greasy strands became the soundtrack of domestic vanity. It was a ritual that smelled faintly of perfume, sweat, and surrender. The image of a Victorian woman sitting before her mirror, her maid combing her hair in endless rhythm, captures the essence of the era's contradiction. It was not about comfort or cleanliness, but about endurance disguised as elegance. The smoothness they admired came not from health, but from stillness, from never disturbing what was already decaying. They believed stillness preserved beauty. In truth, it only preserved the illusion of it. Their unwashed hair stood as both a crown and a cage. It reflected society's obsession with control, the fear of change, and the pride in pretending that discomfort was grace. Beneath the powder and oil lay the quiet reality of filth, hidden so carefully it almost became invisible. Their hair glimmered under dim lights, but it carried the scent of days gone unwashed. The same patience that made it beautiful made it sick, and as their scalps weakened and dulled, another belief began to spread, one that promised freshness through fragrance rather than cleanliness. Perfume was the final touch that completed the illusion of refinement in Victorian life. It was a veil of sweetness meant to hide the truth of a body that was rarely clean. Every dressing table held small bottles of fragrance, their glass shaped like gems and their contents shimmering like coloured light. The women who used them believed perfume was both protection and identity. In a time when bathing was limited, scent became a substitute for purity. But what lingered in those bottles was far from harmless. The sweet, lingering aroma that filled rooms came from substances so toxic they could destroy the skin they touched. It is almost comical that women sprayed death upon themselves in pursuit of elegance. Perfume makers of the era worked with crude tools and dangerous materials. There were no chemical standards, no laws against using what was found to be effective, regardless of safety. Musk, drawn from the glands of animals, was mixed with resin scraped from rotting trees. To preserve the scent, many perfumers added arsenic, mercury, or lead compounds that extended its life on the skin. These poisons clung tightly to fabric and flesh, giving the impression of luxury and permanence. When sprayed directly onto skin or undergarments, the irritation often began quickly, with a burning sensation, a rash that spread, and small sores forming beneath layers of lace. Yet women saw this as proof that the perfume was strong. The pain itself became part of the charm. In parlours and theatres, the air was heavy with competing fragrances. One woman's scent of roses mixed with another's musk and another's lavender, until the space became a fog of sweetness that concealed everything, including the smell of unwashed skin. Men praised these perfumes as signs of delicacy and breeding. The truth was that each drop carried its own measure of poison. If this existed today, it would be like using cleaning bleach as a body mist and calling it a luxury fragrance. Yet within Victorian society, danger gave allure. The longer the scent lasted, the higher its value. Perfume that faded quickly was dismissed as cheap, no matter how safe it might have been. The application itself was almost ritualistic. A few drops on the neck, a mist over the chest, and sometimes a generous spray between the layers of petticoats. Women kept small atomizers in their bags to refresh their scent throughout the day. Many even perfumed their gloves, believing the smell would soften their touch. With each reapplication, the chemicals accumulated, sinking into pores and fabric fibers alike. At night, when corsets and dresses were removed, the smell still clung to the body, thick and sweet. Some women even sprinkled perfume on their bedsheets before sleep, surrounding themselves in artificial fragrance because true cleanliness was too rare to offer comfort. Perfume became a symbol of virtue, though its roots were anything but pure. The most prized scents were derived from animals: musk from deer, civet from wild cats, ambergris from whales. These exotic sources gave an air of mystery and sophistication, but the production was cruel and unsanitary, and the mixtures easily spoiled. To disguise the decay, manufacturers added stronger chemicals, making the scent sharper and more enduring. The result was an invisible costume, something worn as proudly as a jewelled brooch, but infinitely more dangerous. Women measured their worth in how long their perfume could be noticed after they left a room. A lingering scent was power. The irony was that these same fragrances often caused fainting, headaches, and nausea in crowded spaces. Doctors occasionally warned that too much perfume weakens the nerves, yet few dared to question fashion. Among the upper class, to lack fragrance was to appear poor or uncultured. Even servants imitated their mistresses, using diluted mixtures that still contained traces of poison. The difference was only in concentration, not in risk. Across all levels of society, perfume became both a weapon and a mask. The illusion of cleanliness was so complete that few realized it was the smell of decay dressed in sweetness. In private moments, the truth showed itself. Red marks bloomed on the skin where perfume had been applied. Some women developed chronic coughs or dizziness, their bodies slowly poisoned by daily exposure. Yet they continued, trapped by a culture that demanded fragrance as proof of refinement. Beauty was not supposed to feel safe. It was meant to demand endurance. The more it hurt, the more valuable it seemed. There is something deeply unsettling about a world that mistook pain for polish and poison for grace. The world of Victorian fragrance reveals how easily danger became luxury. Bottles lined up on vanity tables glowed like jewels, but inside was the scent of corruption, both literal and moral. Women misted themselves each morning, believing they were becoming more beautiful, while their bodies quietly absorbed the cost. What began as a cover for unwashed skin became an addiction. Without perfume, they felt exposed, incomplete, almost less human. Their scent lingered in rooms long after they left, blending with smoke, oil, and the faint odour of decay that hung over the cities. To breathe in such air was to inhale both elegance and ruin. Yet no one wanted to live without it. The illusion of sweetness was more comforting than the reality of filth. The perfume that promised beauty ended up marking its wearers with quiet suffering. Its sweetness masked the sourness beneath, both on the skin and in the society that demanded it. What began as a way to hide the body soon became a way to hide the truth itself. The scent of poison had become the smell of grace. The perfumes that once promised charm now revealed how far women would go to please the eyes and noses of others. Behind that fragrant fog, another obsession with control over the body was waiting to tighten its grip in ways far more visible and suffocating. The corset was more than a garment. It was an idea stitched into the body. Victorian women pulled the laces tight each morning until their breath shortened, and their ribs creaked beneath the strain. The mirror reflected beauty, but the body underneath told a story of pressure and submission. To achieve the perfect hourglass figure, the corset was drawn tighter day by day, forcing the waist inward while pushing the chest and hips outward. The result was the famous S-shaped posture that defined femininity in that era. Elegant to look at, yet suffocating to live inside. It is both tragic and ironic that an age obsessed with morality built its symbol of virtue on crushed bones and displaced organs. Inside the corset, the body did not belong to the woman, it belonged to society's design. The whalebone and steel strips acted as silent enforcers of discipline. Each pull of the lace reminded her of her place, fragile, refined, and always restrained. Breathing became a conscious effort. Meals grew smaller, and fainting turned into a social norm. Fainting couches were not just decoration, they were necessities. The weakness that came from constriction was mistaken for delicacy. A pale face and trembling hands were signs of beauty, not distress. Men saw fragility as charm, and women learned to disguise pain as elegance. The corset reshaped not only the body, but also the way women moved through the world. Sitting required precision, standing demanded stillness, and laughter risked discomfort. Even gestures became deliberate, trained by fabric and bone. The garment moulded behaviour as much as form. To wear it properly was to master silence, to control breath, and to appear calm, no matter how much it hurt. If this existed today, it would be like wearing a steel cage every day just to post a perfect picture online and calling it empowerment. The corset turned life into performance, and every movement became part of the show. Mothers began the ritual early for their daughters. Tight lacing was introduced in girlhood, when ribs were still soft and spines still growing. A narrow waist was proof of good upbringing and moral restraint. To let the body develop freely was considered careless, even vulgar. Young girls learned to sleep in lighter corsets so that their shape would remain ideal through the night. Some lost their appetite altogether, and others developed breathing problems that lasted for life. The suffering was hidden behind lace and silk, invisible to the polite society that applauded their appearance. Doctors occasionally warned of danger, but their voices were drowned out by fashion columns and social gossip. Corsets were not all identical. For the rich, they were custom-made, trimmed with ribbons, and fitted perfectly to the body's curvature. For the poor, they were hand-me-downs or cheaply made from the rough fabric that cut into the skin. The wealthy fainted gracefully. The working women simply endured. What they shared was the same belief that worth could be measured in inches. The smaller the waist, the greater the virtue. The fashion industry thrived on this belief, selling endless variations, morning corsets, evening corsets, and even special designs for pregnancy. Each claimed comfort and health, yet all inflicted the same quiet harm. Underneath, the body adapted in grotesque ways. Organs shifted upward, lungs compressed, and the stomach pressed down. Over time, bones reshaped themselves to fit the garment's demand. Some women developed internal bleeding, others chronic fainting or deformities, yet they persisted. The mirror's promise was more powerful than pain. Society equated beauty with control, and control with morality. To loosen the corset, even slightly, was to risk judgment. The price of respectability was endurance. There is something deeply sad in how a culture could convince half its people that suffering was the same as virtue. In crowded ballrooms, corsets defined the silhouette of desire. The lamps glowed softly against satin gowns, and every woman's waist seemed impossibly small. Behind each smile there was dizziness. Behind every graceful bow, a hidden gasp for air. Perfume masked the faint odour of sweat trapped beneath layers of cloth. Men saw elegance. Women felt confinement. Yet no one dared question it. The corset was more than fashion, it was identity. Without it, a woman was unfinished, improper, exposed. Even in private, many continued to wear them, afraid of losing the shape that society had trained them to believe was their worth. There were moments of rebellion. A few reformers spoke against tight lacing, calling it a tool of oppression. They designed looser garments, arguing that comfort could coexist with beauty. Their efforts were mocked. Newspapers called them indecent, accusing them of trying to destroy femininity itself. The irony was bitter freedom was considered shameful, and pain was considered grace. The corset remained strong long after the voices for change faded, its legacy wrapped around the very idea of womanhood. The corset's cruelty went beyond the physical. It shaped how women thought of themselves. Every breath was a reminder of constraint, every ache a whisper of inadequacy. Yet to remove it was unthinkable, for nakedness before society was far worse than pain. The constant pressure blurred the line between body and identity until both became one rigid form, polished on the outside, bruised underneath. Even sleep did not bring full release. The body carried its memory, the faint ache of restraint lingering through the night. In portraits and photographs, corseted women still appear calm, poised, unbroken. The viewer sees elegance, not endurance. The whalebone lines beneath the dress remain invisible, like the expectations they represented. Time has turned them into symbols of romance. But their true story is far darker, a history of beauty that demanded submission. The shape it created lived longer than the women who wore it, influencing fashion and self-image for generations to come. The corset's legacy is a haunting reminder of how far people will go to meet an impossible standard. It wrapped discipline around the body and called it beauty, crushed breath into silence and called it grace. The pain it caused was hidden under satin and smiles, a secret shared by nearly every woman who wore one. The corset defined elegance while quietly teaching obedience. It turned beauty into a burden that could not be removed. As its laces tightened, so did the hold of society on the female body, preparing it for the next form of control disguised as fashion. Bathing, in the Victorian mind, was not a habit of health, but a subject of caution. Water, they believed, could weaken the body, disturb the balance of humours, and invite illness through the pores. For women, especially, it was said to threaten delicacy, fertility, and moral restraint. Instead of stepping into a bath, many preferred to wipe their bodies with damp cloth soaked in perfume or rosewater, leaving the skin covered in a film of fragrance and residue. The act was quick, gentle, and symbolic rather than cleansing. It was thought to preserve softness while protecting the body from the supposed dangers of full immersion. It is strangely humorous that they feared the very thing that could have saved them from their own filth. The connection between water and danger was deeply ingrained. Doctors and pamphlets warned that too much bathing could drain the body's strength, especially for women in childbearing years. Some claimed that hot baths overstimulated the nerves and stirred indecent desires. Others insisted that cold water might shock the system and bring on fainting fits. The solution was moderation, which in practice meant avoidance. Women of high standing often went weeks without a true bath, relying instead on powders, scented cloths, and a change of linen to maintain the illusion of freshness. Servants warmed small bowls of water each morning, enough only for wiping the face, hands, and neck. The rest of the body was left untouched. In wealthy homes, ornate bathtubs existed more as decoration than utility. They stood gleaming in corners of rooms, rarely filled. Plumbing was unreliable, and the effort of heating water was left to servants who often had neither time nor patience. When a lady decided to bathe, the process required an entire household's assistance, boiling kettles, carrying buckets, and adjusting screens for modesty. Such a ritual was reserved for illness or special occasions, never daily life. To smell faintly of perfume was respectable. To smell of soap was considered coarse. If this existed today, it would be like refusing to shower for a month but spraying designer perfume and calling it wellness. The irony lay in how this restraint was celebrated as discipline. Manuals on feminine behaviour praised women who avoided frequent washing, linking it to moral purity. Cleanliness of the spirit was said to matter more than cleanliness of the skin. Mothers instructed their daughters that water could disrupt a woman's natural balance, even provoke inappropriate thoughts. The fear of bodily stimulation through warmth and touch became an unspoken rule of modesty. What began as superstition evolved into social virtue. Those who bathed often were quietly judged, suspected of indulgence or moral looseness. For the poor, the choice was simpler: bathing was simply impossible. In crowded tenements, where water was scarce and costly to heat, families shared one basin for all washing needs. The water turned grey after the first use, but it was reused until nothing remained clear. Smell became part of life, blending with the smoke of coal and the dampness of clothing. Among the working class, the unwashed body was not shameful, it was inevitable. Yet even they absorbed the same belief that frequent bathing was unnatural. Clean water was feared almost as much as desired. To cover what could not be cleaned, scent became salvation. Bottles of floral water lined dressing tables, their purpose not to cleanse but to disguise. Women poured small amounts onto handkerchiefs, patting their wrists, necks, and behind their ears. Some even dabbed it under their arms or along the hems of their skirts. The mixture of sweat and perfume created a sweetness that clung to the air, more powerful than cleanliness itself. It was not unusual for undergarments to carry the smell of perfume long after the fabric had grown stiff with residue. To outsiders, it seemed pleasant. To those who lived within it, it was suffocating. In journals of the time, a few voices questioned these customs. Travellers who visited other countries wrote in surprise about people who bathed daily and appeared healthier for it. Doctors occasionally noted the connection between skin disease and the lack of hygiene, but such ideas took decades to find acceptance. The notion of a woman willingly exposing her entire body to water remained unthinkable to the moral gatekeepers of society. A clean body was too close to a sensual body, and sensuality was to be feared. Purity meant control, and control meant abstaining from pleasure, even the quiet pleasure of warmth and water. Bathing substitutes became an industry. Companies sold powders labelled as dry baths, promising cleanliness without risk. These mixtures absorbed oil and sweat, leaving a soft texture on the skin, but did nothing to remove dirt. Some women carried small sponges scented with lavender, using them to dab rather than wash. The habit of wiping replaced the habit of rinsing. It fit perfectly into a world that prized restraint over reality, appearance over truth. The Victorian lady did not scrub, she dabbed, she did not rinse, she scented. Behind these customs lay the fear of what was natural. The body, in all its warmth and smell, was something to be hidden, even from oneself. The less it was touched, the purer it seemed. Yet that same denial trapped women in cycles of discomfort, itching, infections, and rashes, all dismissed as delicate sensitivities of the female constitution. Physicians prescribed tonics, not baths. Modesty was to be preserved at all costs, even when it bred disease. There is something deeply sad in how they confused denial with virtue and turned neglect into a moral achievement. The Victorian relationship with water reflected their broader struggle between nature and control. In their pursuit of purity, they made themselves prisoners of their own rules. The smell of perfume replaced the feeling of freshness, and the cold wipe of a cloth became the substitute for renewal. The idea that water could be dangerous was easier to accept than the idea that pleasure could be innocent. The unwashed body of the Victorian woman was not a mark of laziness but of obedience. It was the outcome of a world that feared the body's desires more than its decay. Cleanliness was redefined to fit restraint, until restraint itself became the highest form of beauty. The glistening skin in paintings and portraits hid a truth of residue and fatigue, the quiet discomfort of women who dared not do what their own instincts urged them to. They believed they were preserving their health, when in truth they were burying it under powder and perfume. The touch of water could have restored them, but fear had made even that simple act forbidden, and while their bodies grew fragile from years without cleansing, another layer of vanity waited to mask the weakness that water might have washed away. The belief that water was dangerous had protected them from more than dirt. It had protected them from freedom. Soon, that same restraint would return in another form, one that covered not just the skin but the soul itself. The glow of a Victorian woman's cheeks was not a gift of health, but the result of careful irritation. In an age that prized pallor as refinement, a hint of pink across the face became a calculated choice rather than a natural flush. Women wanted to appear delicate but not lifeless, alive but not vulgar. To create that illusion, they turned to small bottles of tinctures made from alcohol, berries, and chemical salts. Among them, nitrate of silver and ammonia mixtures were the most fashionable. When applied to the skin, they caused a sharp sting and a slow bloom of redness. What looked like vitality was, in truth, inflammation. It is almost absurd that they mistook chemical burns for the colour of youth. This ritual was done in silence before mirrors clouded by candle smoke. A lady would sit still as her maid dipped a soft cloth into a mixture of wine, crushed strawberries, or sometimes a diluted acid solution. The liquid smelled sweet at first, but left a metallic trace behind. With careful strokes, it was rubbed onto the cheeks until the skin tingled. Within moments, warmth spread across the face, giving the illusion of health. The process became so familiar that women began to recognize the difference between a mild burn and an effective one. Pain meant beauty. The sting assured them that the product was working. For those who could not afford prepared cosmetics, home recipes filled the gap. Newspapers published natural blush methods involving vinegar, salt, and even diluted spirit of nitric acid. The logic was simple: to irritate the skin just enough to force blood to the surface. Some mixed crushed red beetroot with brandy and stored it in small jars, painting their faces before outings. Others used stronger concoctions that left permanent marks. Small scars or patches of rawness were accepted as a fair trade for the glow of fashion. What mattered was appearance, not comfort. If this existed today, it would be like people rubbing sandpaper on their faces and calling the scratches a healthy glow. The danger was quietly ignored. Chemical irritation led to chronic rashes, peeling skin, and in some cases, open sores that refused to heal. Women who suffered these effects were advised to cover them with powder rather than stop using the product. The more the skin was damaged, the more makeup was needed, creating a cycle of destruction disguised as maintenance. It was not unusual to see patches of discoloration beneath the rosy layer. Still, society admired the effort. A woman's ability to endure discomfort without complaint was seen as proof of grace. Pain, once again, became the measure of discipline. Doctors occasionally warned against the use of corrosive ingredients, but their concerns were dismissed as unmanly interference in the realm of beauty. Fashion was stronger than medicine. The growing cosmetic market promised miracles, youth, vitality, and charm in a single jar. Behind the scenes, manufacturers blended whatever ingredients produced visible results, regardless of toxicity. Some formulas included mercury, others lead mixed with dyes extracted from cochineal insects. Labels offered little truth, and customers rarely asked. The only measure of success was how long the flush lasted. This obsession with artificial vitality reflected more than vanity. It revealed fear. The Victorian woman lived under constant expectation to appear both modest and radiant, innocent yet alluring. Her pale skin had to suggest purity, but her cheeks had to hint at life. It was a narrow balance maintained by deceit and discomfort. In public, She smiled gently, her face framed by the soft glow of chemical blush. In private, she dabbed at the burning skin, whispering to herself that beauty required sacrifice. The message had been taught so early that few questioned it. The practice spread across all classes. The wealthy purchased imported products from Paris, while the poor relied on kitchen experiments. Street markets sold small bottles labelled Rose of Health or Bloom of Youth, often made with cheap alcohol and coloured powders. The names were comforting, the results often cruel. Some mixtures caused blistering so severe that scabs formed, leaving behind uneven scars. Yet once healed, women returned to the same bottles. The illusion of vitality mattered more than the reality of damage. The redder the cheeks, the more alive one appeared, even if the rest of the body was exhausted. The symbolism of colour ran deep. In portraits, artists painted women with subtle blushes to represent purity, fertility, and moral warmth. Society adopted the same language, translating art into daily practice. To lack colour was to lack spirit. To glow was to be admired. The blush became not only cosmetic but moral, a visible sign of life and virtue. It was a performance played on the surface of the skin, repeated day after day until the skin itself became the stage. There is something quietly tragic about how they believed that the pain beneath the glow was part of the beauty itself. Even as medicine advanced, the habit endured. Some doctors proposed gentler alternatives, using vegetable dyes or milder spirits, but most women distrusted anything that did not sting. They wanted proof of transformation, proof that they were doing something to conquer nature. The subtle flush of health was never enough. Artificial colour was controllable, reliable, and permanent. The irony was that the more they tried to look alive, the more lifeless their faces became under the layers of chemical disguise. In the private space of their dressing rooms, mirrors told a quiet truth. The redness that once seemed charming now lingered too long, deepening into irritation. Powder cracked on rough skin, perfumes failed to hide the scent of alcohol, and fingers trembled from repeated exposure. But still, the ritual continued. To stop was to surrender to plainness, to admit aging, to reveal what society called imperfection. The rosy glow that defined Victorian beauty was not born from youth, but from suffering. It was a quiet rebellion against pallor and death, achieved through methods that brought both closer. Women painted vitality onto their faces while draining it from their bodies. They smiled through the sting, convinced that the burn meant life. Their cheeks shone with colour, but the warmth came from harm, not health. Beneath the pretty illusion, the skin ached and throbbed in silence. And just as the redness began to fade, another obsession was already waiting, one that would move from the face to the eyes, promising enchantment at an even greater cost. The Victorian fascination with eyes was a quiet obsession that bordered on danger. A woman's gaze was her power, her means of influence in a world that gave her few others. Large, glistening eyes were the mark of innocence and allure, something that could melt or command with a single look. To achieve this effect, women turned to a plant both beautiful and deadly belladonna, the beautiful lady, extracted from its glossy black berries. The tincture was dropped into the eyes to dilate the pupils, creating the illusion of depth and mystery. Within moments, the world blurred, and the eyes swelled with unnatural shine. It is almost ridiculous that blindness became a side effect of beauty considered worth the risk. The sensation began with a gentle sting. Tears welled up, then the pupils expanded, swallowing the colour of the iris until only a black glossy surface remained. The result was haunting, eyes that seemed endlessly deep like polished glass. In candlelight, they caught every flicker of flame, reflecting it with dreamlike intensity. Men described such eyes as enchanting, unaware that behind the shimmer lay pain and strain. Women who used belladonna saw less and less of the world around them. Light became unbearable. Reading, Sewing, and even walking outdoors grew difficult. Yet, they continued. The look it gave was too powerful to abandon. Belladonna drops were sold in small, elegant bottles, often labelled essence of nightshade. Apothecaries treated it as medicine, while perfumers disguised it as a beauty aid. Its presence in dressing tables was a secret shared among women, whispered between sisters or friends. The first drops gave a temporary glow, but prolonged use led to trembling, dizziness, and partial blindness. Still, the product was praised in fashion magazines, described as the secret to eyes that speak without words. The irony was that those very eyes, admired for their sparkle, could no longer see clearly enough to recognize the faces that adored them. If this existed today, it would be like injecting one's eyes with a toxin just to look photogenic under soft lighting. Doctors knew the dangers but spoke carefully. The women who came to them with failing vision were often of high status, and confronting vanity was socially delicate. A few physicians wrote warnings in medical journals describing how the plant attacked the optic nerves, but for most, the damage was invisible until it was irreversible. The blindness crept slowly. First difficulty in focusing, then light sensitivity, and finally the dimming of the world into shadow. Some refused to admit it, insisting the world had merely grown darker with age. In truth, they had chosen that darkness in exchange for admiration. The symbolism of eyes had long haunted Victorian art and literature. Poets wrote of the gaze as the gateway to the soul. Painters captured it as a mirror of emotion. Women learned early that their eyes were their most persuasive feature. Belladonna made them larger, softer, more doll-like. The ideal of beauty shaped by men and sold back to women as destiny. The danger of the drug only added to its allure. Something was thrilling in wearing poison so close to life itself, something intoxicating about the idea of beauty that could kill. The plant's name, after all, meant beautiful woman for a reason. For poorer women, imitation was their only path. They used mixtures of vinegar and brandy, or diluted belladonna extracts from untrained herbalists. These crude solutions caused infections, clouded corneas, and permanent damage. Yet the desire remained. Even those who could barely afford food spent coins on bottles that promised beauty in a blink. The pain was dismissed as proof of authenticity, a sacrifice to the altar of fashion. As one writer of the time observed, a lady's gaze must not be plain, even if the price is sight. In crowded parlours, the results gleamed like magic. Women's eyes shone beneath veils and feathers, catching the light of chandeliers. Men called them angelic, unaware that behind the glow was the raw sting of poison. Many could not see the faces speaking to them clearly, relying on memory and tone rather than sight. Yet their half-blind smiles were praised as modest and mysterious. Beauty, once again, was confusion polished into charm. There is something quietly heartbreaking about a world that admired the look of wonder more than the ability to truly see. Belladonna did not only blind eyes, it blurred the lines between admiration and cruelty. The women who used it were both victims and participants, enforcing upon themselves the ideals that trapped them. Their glowing pupils became symbols of devotion, to beauty, to social order, to the belief that pain refined the soul. In portraits, their eyes appear luminous, eternal. No one remembers the trembling hands that held the dropper, or the quiet dread that came when the world began to fade around them. When vision failed, the ritual stopped, but its mark remained. The once wide eyes grew dull and glassy, unable to bear daylight. Some women spent their later years in shadowed rooms, wearing veils to protect against the light they could no longer enjoy. Their beauty had outlived their sight, and society called it a fair trade. The poison that made them alluring also ensured their invisibility, a cruel symmetry the era never questioned. The story of Belladonna is one of contradiction. Beauty born from blindness, charm built on decay. It showed how far the Victorian ideal would go to sculpt a woman's body into art, even if it meant destroying her senses. The glowing eyes that captivated so many were never windows to the soul, only mirrors reflecting society's hunger for control. Their gaze was mesmerizing, but it was borrowed from poison. The admiration it drew was sharp and fleeting, like light glancing off glass before vanishing into darkness. And as the last reflection dimmed, another obsession began to rise, one that would turn beauty from sight to touch, from the glow of eyes to the sheen of skin. Long fingernails in the Victorian world were more than decoration. They were a declaration of privilege, smooth, pointed, and carefully maintained. They spoke of a life untouched by labour, a body that existed for display rather than work. In portraits, women rested their hands gracefully on books or silk fabrics, the light catching the curve of the nail. Each fingertip told a story of leisure and distance from toil. To keep nails long and polished required not only time, but servants, powders, and patience. The longer they grew, the clearer the message became. These were hands that never touched soil, tools, or anything that might dull their shine. It is almost amusing that a set of fragile nails became proof of power in an age obsessed with control. The care process was slow and delicate. Nails were filed into a soft taper, shaped not by instruments, but by gentle rubbing with fine cloth or lemon peel. Buffing powders made from crushed shells or chalk gave them a faint pearly sheen. Polish was not coloured yet. Instead, the goal was natural lustre, a glow that suggested purity. Women soaked their fingertips in rose water or milk to keep them soft, while servants trimmed any uneven edges with embroidery scissors. Gloves were worn constantly, indoors and out, to protect the nails from dust and sunlight. Even writing too quickly could risk breaking one. So letters were composed slowly, movements measured. Hands became a performance in themselves. Those who could not afford this luxury improvised. Working women smeared beeswax over their nails to strengthen them, though constant chores undid the effort within hours. The difference between hands that laboured and hands that did not was one of the most visible class distinctions of the time. Society noticed. Newspapers described noble women's hands as ivory and unblemished, while poorer women were mocked for ruddy fingers. The obsession extended beyond vanity. It became a form of social identification. If this existed today, it would be like posting manicured hands online as a symbol of success while pretending the effort behind them did not exist. Men, too, paid attention. Poets compared pale hands to lilies, and lovers praised the fragility of a woman's touch. Weakness was reimagined as grace. Women were encouraged to let their nails grow until daily function became inconvenient. To break one was not only painful but embarrassing, as though a part of their refinement had chipped away. Beauty guides warned against rough gestures and firm grasps. Hands were to remain still, hovering gently above objects, as if made of porcelain. The less a woman's hands could do, the more beautiful they appeared. This ideal was reinforced by the objects surrounding them. Fans, lace gloves, and handkerchiefs were designed not just for utility but for display. A woman's hand fluttering above a fan could attract as much attention as her eyes or lips. Gloves hid imperfections but hinted at delicacy beneath. Even the act of removing a glove in company was charged with meaning, a slow, deliberate motion revealing the fragile nails beneath, like a ritual unveiling status itself. The fragility was seductive. Weakness, when dressed in silk, became its own kind of strength. For the working poor, such ideals were distant dreams. Their hands bore the marks of survival-cracked knuckles, calloused palms, dirt that no amount of washing could fully remove. Yet even among them, the myth of soft hands lingered. Brides tried to lighten their skin with vinegar soaks before weddings, hoping for a touch of refinement. The gap between rich and poor could be seen as clearly in the hands as in the clothes. To possess long nails was to display not beauty alone, but exemption from labour, from struggle, from necessity itself. Magazines printed endless advice for maintaining the perfect hand. Never touch cold water, they warned, and avoid rough fabrics. Women followed these instructions religiously, even when impractical. Servants prepared warm cloths to wipe their mistress's fingers after meals, avoiding direct contact with anything that might dull the surface. Every gesture reinforced the illusion of delicacy. The hands that signed invitations or poured tea were carefully choreographed instruments, trained to move slowly, gracefully, never too firmly. There is something quietly tragic in how these women turned their own bodies into fragile ornaments for the sake of admiration. But admiration had its costs. Fingernails, softened by milk and oil, broke easily. Infection followed quickly in a time without modern medicine. Beneath the polished surface, many women suffered from chronic irritation or fungal growth hidden beneath gloves. They ignored the pain, hiding discoloured nails with powder or paint. To admit imperfection was unthinkable. The illusion had to remain unbroken. The suffering was private, the beauty public. Art and literature immortalised this contradiction. In paintings, women's hands were painted impossibly smooth, the nails faintly shining. They held flowers, letters, or teacups, symbols of refinement and fragility. The working hand was invisible in such art, erased from the record of what womanhood was supposed to look like. The world admired the softness, forgetting that softness often came from constraint. The nails themselves were symbols of stillness. They did not bend or break easily, because the women who wore them learned not to move too much. They became icons of restraint, visible reminders of how femininity was defined by inaction. To be beautiful was to be still. To be still was to be safe from judgment. Yet behind the quiet composure was exhaustion, a constant effort to preserve what was never meant to last. Long nails became a mirror for Victorian values, appearance over substance, delicacy over strength, submission over freedom. They represented a beauty that thrived on denial, the same denial that shaped every part of a woman's life. What began as elegance ended as limitation, a symbol of refinement that quietly mocked the body it adorned. Their hands gleamed softly beneath layers of lace, flawless yet fragile, admired more for stillness than for strength. The smooth surface that spoke of beauty also whispered of constraint and silence. Beneath that quiet grace, another obsession waited, one that would trade pain for purity, turning even the act of smiling into another form of suffering. White teeth in Victorian England were more than a symbol of cleanliness. They were a badge of privilege. The rich could afford treatments that promised brightness, while the poor had to hide their smiles behind stained lips and silence. But even among the wealthy, the secret of a gleaming smile came with pain. The most common method to whiten teeth was also the most destructive, rinsing the mouth with vinegar or highly concentrated lemon juice. The acid ate away the surface of enamel, stripping away years of stains and leaving a dazzling, temporary shine. It is strangely comical that people willingly dissolved their own teeth for the sake of elegance. The taste was sharp, burning as it touched the gums. Women described the sensation as refreshing, a polite way of ignoring the sting. The liquid was swirled in the mouth after meals, often followed by brushing with chalk or salt to polish the surface. These mixtures left a pale lustre that sparkled in candlelight but weakened the teeth each day. Within months, the enamel thinned, revealing the yellow dentin beneath. The cycle was cruel the more one tried to whiten, the darker the teeth became once the outer layer was gone. And so, the solution was simple: more acid. Fashion magazines and etiquette guides praised a perfect smile as a sign of refinement. A lady's teeth were to be small, even, and white, symbols of restraint and care. To laugh too openly or show too much was improper, but when she did smile, the whiteness had to gleam. For this illusion, countless women kept bottles of tooth brightener in their cabinets. These concoctions mixed vinegar, alum, and even traces of arsenic. Sold in elegant glass vials, they promised purity and confidence. They delivered corrosion instead. If this existed today, it would be like rinsing with bleach before a party and calling it a beauty hack. Dentistry at the time was more horror than healing. Toothpaste, as we know it now, did not exist. People brushed with coarse powders made from crushed brick, ashes, or ground coral. Some mixed these abrasives with acid-based liquids to enhance the shine. The result was immediate brilliance and long-term ruin. Teeth chipped easily, gums receded, and the mouth filled with sores. Yet the glow in the mirror was enough to quiet any doubt. Pain was seen as proof that it was working. Women told each other that discomfort meant cleanliness, and they smiled through the ache. The obsession with white teeth also reflected the age's moral pretensions. A bright smile was equated with purity, a clean mouth with a clean soul. The poor, whose teeth were darkened by cheap food and bad water, were labelled as morally weak. The rich, with their acid-polished smiles, were thought more virtuous simply because they could afford to destroy their teeth in elegance. In salons, men complimented women on their pearl-like teeth, not realizing that the pearls were slowly crumbling from within. To be admired was to be decaying gracefully. At home, the ritual was private but relentless. After dinner, women dipped cloths into diluted acid and rubbed their teeth carefully, watching in handheld mirrors as the enamel dulled to a softer white. Servants stood by with bowls of water to rinse away the excess, though rarely enough to neutralize the acid. The smell of vinegar filled the air, mixing with perfume and powder. Some women grew so accustomed to the taste that they began carrying small bottles in their purses for quick use before social events. Dentists quietly warned that teeth could rot within years, but few listened. Vanity always shouted louder than caution. The belief in acid's purity was not entirely unfounded. For centuries, vinegar has been used to disinfect and cleanse. When applied to teeth, it seemed to perform the same magic. The squeaky sensation left on the enamel was mistaken for cleanliness. In truth, it was the sound of loss, the enamel thinning under chemical assault. The bright surface reflected light beautifully, and under the dim glow of candles, it looked like perfection. But daylight revealed another story: brittle edges, dark spots, and the faint transparency of teeth hollowed out by beauty's demands. To cover the damage, women began to use powders tinted with white chalk or pearl dust. Some even mixed in traces of mercury to enhance the shine. These powders left a smooth film over the teeth, creating the illusion of health. But when saliva mixed with them, they produced a metallic taste and further irritation. The gums bled, the breath soured, and the illusion demanded constant upkeep. It was a quiet misery disguised as refinement, and like so many Victorian rituals, it endured because no one dared question it. Men, too, joined this pursuit, though in quieter ways. Public image mattered, and a gentleman's smile was expected to convey confidence. They used milder rinses, often wine mixed with lemon peel or alum, to maintain colour without appearing vain. Still, the results were the same. The acid corroded slowly, invisibly, until teeth loosened and fell. False teeth became a thriving industry, made from ivory or the teeth of the dead. The irony was grim people destroyed their natural smiles chasing perfection, only to replace them with borrowed remains. There is something deeply unsettling about how the pursuit of beauty often ends in imitation of life itself. As years passed, the damage became impossible to hide. Women covered their mouths when speaking, laughed softly behind fans, and smiled only in candlelight. The fear of being seen too clearly replaced the pride that had once driven the ritual. Dentists began promoting milder alternatives, powders made with baking soda and herbs. But by then, the ideal had already carved its mark into generations of women. The Victorian smile, so often praised in poetry and portraits, was an illusion built on decay. Behind the polished words of admiration lay the quiet truth of pain and fragility. The same acids that made the teeth shine also marked the end of their strength. In trying to appear pure, they had stripped away what was real, leaving only a fragile shell of beauty. Their smiles gleamed under candlelight, but the brightness was borrowed and brief. Beneath the shine lay pain, rot, and silence, masked by elegance and pride. And while their teeth crumbled away in pursuit of perfection, a new obsession was already spreading, one that would test the body's endurance even further, teaching women that true virtue meant learning to suffer beautifully. Victorian womanhood was built on endurance, the quiet acceptance of pain as proof of virtue. Nowhere was this belief more visible than in how women managed their own bodies during menstruation. Hygiene was rarely discussed, and when it was, it came wrapped in silence and shame. Girls were taught early that discomfort was a mark of purity and restraint. The idea of using something clean or convenient to absorb blood was considered improper, almost indulgent. Instead, most women relied on rags torn from old linen, washed and reused until they fell apart. They called it thrift. Society called it modesty. It is both tragic and absurd that an age obsessed with refinement accepted filth as proof of moral strength. The reality of this custom was unpleasant, but it was hidden behind the politeness of daily life. In private, women folded layers of coarse fabric and tied them in place with thin cords or bits of ribbon. The material was rough, cold, and difficult to keep still. As they moved through their day, the fabric shifted, chafing the skin and spreading odour. When washed, it never came fully clean. Stains lingered, faint but permanent, like the quiet evidence of cycles never spoken of. Water was often scarce, and soap expensive, so many used the same rags for weeks. For the lower classes, even that was a luxury. Some simply bled into their undergarments or onto straw beds. The act of cleaning oneself was reduced to wiping, dabbing, or waiting. In the eyes of society, this suffering carried dignity. Menstruation was not seen as something to ease, but something to bear. Pamphlets advised girls to stay composed, avoid cold air, and never complain. A woman's silence during pain was praised as grace. The blood was natural but unmentionable, and its stains, if seen, did not provoke disgust. They evoked a kind of quiet pride. A visible mark on a dress or chair was treated as proof of a woman's burden, not of carelessness. To hide it completely might suggest vanity, or worse, indecency. Women were expected to endure without invention, to accept the inconvenience as part of their divine design. If this existed today, it would be like applauding people for refusing medicine just to prove they could suffer beautifully. For the wealthy, the story was hardly better. Even ladies of a leisure used similar methods, preferring folded cloths over any device that entered the body. The idea of inserting cotton or padding was considered obscene, an act that violated feminine modesty. When disposable sanitary products were first proposed late in the century, they were dismissed as immoral and unladylike. Cleanliness, it seemed, could threaten purity. Servants were tasked with washing the soiled cloths discreetly, boiling them behind the kitchens, or hanging them to dry in hidden corners of gardens. The smell, the stains, the exhaustion, all of it was accepted with a grim composure that Victorians mistook for virtue. Medical literature of the time reflected the same contradiction. Doctors wrote about menstruation as a delicate crisis of womanhood, a moment demanding stillness and submission. They advised women not to bathe, not to walk too far, and not to strain the mind or spirit. Bleeding was seen as nature's way of purging excess emotion, proof of fragility and moral depth. The idea that it could also cause infection or illness if managed poorly was largely ignored. Instead, the blame for discomfort fell on the woman herself. Too emotional, too active, too modern. Her pain was not a signal of neglect, but a sign of femininity well performed. Among poorer women, the experience was far harsher. Labourers and factory workers had no option but to continue working, blood soaking through layers of clothing as they moved. The air in mills and workshops was thick with dust and sweat, the smell of unwashed rags mixing with smoke and oil. There were no private facilities, no place to change or clean. The humiliation of it all became routine, invisible through repetition. Some wrapped rags so tightly that circulation failed, others went without entirely. The body was left to fend for itself. Religious influence deepened this quiet suffering. Many believed that menstrual blood was unclean, a symbol of Eve's sin. To seek comfort during that time was to resist divine order. Pain, therefore, became sacred. Mothers passed this belief to daughters, not out of cruelty, but out of inheritance. They spoke of endurance as grace, telling young girls to accept what could not be changed. The first blood was not a celebration of growth, but an initiation into restraint. A girl learned that her body was a thing to endure, not to understand. In private journals, rare glimpses of honesty appear. Women wrote of the exhaustion, the smell, the fear of staining furniture or sheets. Some admitted crying quietly at night, ashamed not of the blood but of their own disgust toward it. Yet even these confessions were softened by the language of duty. They saw themselves as soldiers of propriety, fighting invisible battles against their own biology. The idea of comfort seemed selfish, even sinful. To suffer silently was to be good. The cost of this silence was not only physical but psychological. It taught generations of women that their needs were secondary, their pain ornamental. Menstruation was natural, yet women were made to feel unnatural for wishing relief. This contradiction became the foundation of how society treated female discomfort, something to romanticize, not to resolve. It was easier to celebrate endurance than to question why it was necessary. There is something deeply sorrowful in how the simplest act of care was denied in the name of virtue. By the end of the century, when new hygienic inventions began to appear, they were met with suspicion. Advertisements for early pads or tampons avoided direct mention of blood, using coded words like delicacy or protection. Most women ignored them, clinging to familiar discomfort as a mark of respectability. Even those curious enough to try often hid the items, ashamed of being caught seeking ease. The pattern of denial continued, generation after generation learning that to bleed was to suffer, and to suffer quietly was to be noble. Victorian femininity glorified weakness while punishing need. A woman who smiled through pain was admired. One who sought comfort was condemned. In their effort to appear moral, they turned suffering into a form of beauty, as though endurance itself could cleanse the soul. They believed their sacrifice made them virtuous, that silence kept them pure, that pain confirmed their worth. Beneath those layers of stained fabric and unspoken shame lay a truth too uncomfortable for their world to name. As the body endured in quiet submission, another belief took hold, one that turned even the stench of confinement into something called elegance. Fashion during that era was a kind of fortress, layers upon layers of fabric separating the body from the world, and perhaps from itself. Women dressed each morning not for comfort but for ritual, wrapping themselves in cotton, linen, wool, and silk until only the illusion of grace remained. Each layer had a purpose, yet none served hygiene. The inner garments absorbed sweat, clung to the skin, and were rarely washed. The outer ones trapped scent, preserving it like perfume. What should have been a smell of decay became something else entirely, a signature, a personal aura. It is both fascinating and grotesque that they called the scent of neglect individuality. Underneath the corset came the chemise, meant to protect the expensive layers above from sweat and oil, but it was thin, quickly soaked, and seldom cleaned. Laundry was laborious, soap costly, and water cold. So women kept rotating the same pieces, airing them out at night instead of washing. The smell of the body mingled with the faint fragrance of rosewater dabbed at the wrists, forming a scent so distinct that even servants could identify their mistresses by smell alone. Perfume covered the surface, but never the core. To modern senses, the mixture would have been unbearable stale air, damp fabric, and the sweet-sour odour of skin confined too long. Yet to them, this was refinement the body subdued beneath its own atmosphere. Each additional layer added both weight and warmth. Petticoats, bustles, corsets, chemises, drawers, and outer skirts together could weigh several kilograms. Moving under all that cloth was slow work. The air beneath the garments grew thick with moisture, and the fabric clung to the legs with every step. Women often fainted not just from tight lacing but from overheating. Removing clothes during the day was unthinkable. The body's heat remained trapped, and with it, the smell of life itself. If this existed today, it would be like wearing the same gym clothes for weeks and calling the resulting odour a personal perfume. The justification for this restraint was both moral and aesthetic. Women were told that their scent reflected their soul, that a modest woman exuded a natural sweetness, unlike the vulgarity of soap and cleanliness. Manuals on etiquette advised against overlaundering fine fabrics, warning that frequent washing weakened fibre and invited coarseness. Instead, they recommended brushing, dusting, and airing garments in shaded rooms scented with herbs. This created an illusion of freshness, though nothing was truly clean. Dresses hung stiff with residue, powder, sweat, and the faint shimmer of oils rubbed from the skin. But they looked immaculate from afar, their colours unfaded, their folds untouched by water. Appearances, as always, triumphed over truth. For the poor, imitation came in cheaper fabrics and harsher consequences. Layers still existed, but without the luxury of rotation. Women wore the same underclothes for weeks, the same skirts until seams split. When laundry day came, the water turned black before the first rinse was done. The damp garments, too heavy to dry indoors, froze stiff in the cold. Still, the idea of washing frequently was considered unnecessary, even unwise. Dirt was not the enemy, it was familiarity. A woman's smell marked her identity, her home, her labour. To erase it would have seemed unnatural. In upper society, scent carried social meaning. A faint musk on silk was proof of authenticity, a trace of the living body beneath perfection. Men described their partner's perfume as intimate and distinctive, unaware that what they found alluring came as much from neglect as design. Some women even resisted washing their dresses because they feared losing that familiar scent, the invisible mark of self. Servants sometimes remarked that they could trace a lady's presence in a hallway long after she'd gone, her odour lingering like memory. The physical discomfort of this fashion was immense. The multiple layers weighed heavily on the body, restricting airflow and movement. Rashes and infections flourished where fabric rubbed the skin raw. Doctors occasionally noted cases of garment fever, mild illnesses caused by trapped sweat and bacteria. Still, these warnings were dismissed. Cleanliness required undressing, and undressing risked impropriety. The woman who stripped her layers, even in private, was said to risk her virtue as well as her health. In this world, modesty mattered more than comfort, and propriety smelled faintly of rot. Behind the elegance was an entire economy of maintenance. Servants spent hours brushing dresses, shaking out dust, and pressing folds with irons heated by coal. Washing was reserved for emergencies, spills, stains, or social events too important for appearance to falter. Linen soaked in sweat might be rinsed, but outer dresses often went unwashed for months. Some women wore the same gown for weeks, refreshing it only with perfume or a scattering of herbs inside the hem. As a result, clothing itself became a record of life, a diary written in scent and residue. Wearing so many layers also created a peculiar intimacy between women and their clothing. Fabric became a second skin, shaping the way they moved, sat, and breathed. Every sigh or step stirred the trapped air beneath, releasing faint traces of musk that no one acknowledged, yet everyone sensed. The body's natural processes, sweat, warmth, odour, were not erased but contained, disguised as refinement. Something is haunting in how they mistook confinement for grace and decay for delicacy. When night came, the ritual reversed. Layers were unbuttoned and peeled away slowly, revealing damp linen and reddened skin. The garments were hung on chairs or draped across screens to breathe, though they rarely did. The air in bedrooms was thick, perfumed, and stale, carrying the scent of both wealth and weariness. Women slipped into clean nightgowns that were rarely cleaner than the clothes they replaced. The illusion of gentility never slept. It simply softened under lamplight. Fashion of that age preserved the appearance of order while nurturing the smell of decay. It was a system of denial so complete that even the air between fabric and flesh became part of a woman's identity. To be fragrant was not to be clean, and to be clean was to risk scandal. They wore their own scent like armour, convinced that it made them more human, more beautiful, more themselves. Their layers shimmered with silk and memory, but beneath the folds lay heat, dust, and the faint rot of restraint. The smell that clung to their gowns became their signature, their silent confession to the world. As their dresses grew heavier with time and sweat, another form of intimacy emerged, one that would blur the line between affection and contamination, turning even shared objects into channels of disease. Among women of that age, friendship often took physical form. They shared gloves, ribbons, hairbrushes, and sometimes even earrings. Jewellery was not just decoration, it was a token of closeness, a silent pact between women who lived within rigid social walls. Sharing earrings, in particular, became a gesture of affection. Friends would pass the same pair between them, wearing it on alternate days or splitting the set so that each had one. The act carried the warmth of intimacy, but also the unseen danger of disease. Earrings were not sterilized, and the holes they pierced often stayed sore and inflamed. Still, women saw this discomfort as a small price for connection. It is almost absurd that infection became a symbol of friendship in a society obsessed with purity. To pierce one's ears was itself an event. The ritual was usually performed at home, using a heated needle or a pin pushed through the lobe. A thread or a straw was left inside the hole to keep it open while it healed. The process was painful and crude, often done by mothers or sisters rather than professionals. In wealthier households, a servant might assist, holding the girl's hand as the metal slid through. The blood that followed was wiped away with a cloth dipped in perfume, and the swelling was treated with little more than patience. There was pride in the act, a sense of becoming complete, of stepping into womanhood. When the wounds finally closed, earrings became a mark of maturity. A girl without them was considered childlike or unfinished, not yet part of the world of women. But fine jewellery was expensive, so sharing filled the gap. Friends exchanged earrings before parties, sometimes swapping them mid-week like secret keepsakes. The gesture held emotional weight. To wear another's jewellery was to wear her trust, to carry a piece of her into public spaces where both were expected to behave with restraint. No one questioned the hygiene of it. No one thought about the wounds reopening, or the rust from unclean metal pressing against raw skin. Earrings were rarely cleaned properly. They were made of copper, silver, or brass, materials that tarnished quickly when exposed to sweat. Women wiped them with their handkerchiefs, rubbed them with scented oils, and believed it was enough. Over time, the metal darkened, the clasps grew rough, and the skin beneath turned red and itchy. Yet pain was quietly tolerated. When infection came, swollen lobes, Small abscesses it was treated with poultices or simply ignored. To complain would seem childish. In a culture where fainting from corsets was fashionable, a bit of pain in the ear was practically invisible. If this happened today, it would be like friends sharing the same needle and calling it a bond of trust. What made this practice even more telling was how it blurred the line between intimacy and performance. Friendship among women was one of the few spaces where emotion could exist freely. Society denied them power, freedom, and independence, but allowed affection, so long as it looked delicate and pure. Sharing earrings became a ritual of that tenderness, a private rebellion disguised as gentility. It let them express love without words, closeness without scandal. A tiny shared wound united them. In portraits and photographs, pairs of women appear side by side, their matching earrings glinting under soft light. The shine was subtle but meaningful, a shared signal only they understood. To outsiders, it was fashion. To them, it was something deeper. The skin irritation, the dull ache that came from prolonged wear. These were almost cherished. Pain was not just endured, it was sentimentalized. The slight sting when inserting the earring each morning became a reminder of devotion, proof that the bond had left a mark, both literal and emotional. There was, however, an unspoken irony. The same society that encouraged women to share jewellery warned them to avoid too much closeness. Bonds between women were seen as charming only if they remained shallow, never competing with a man's affection. Earrings, then, served a double purpose. They symbolized unity, but also discipline. They reminded women to be tender, but not independent, to be beautiful, but not self-centered. The infection that sometimes followed became an unintended metaphor, the price of being connected yet confined. In poorer neighborhoods, this custom carried different consequences. Earrings were shared not just for sentiment, but for necessity. Many women owned only one pair, passed from mother to daughter, or borrowed from a neighbor for weddings and church days. The holes were reopened again and again, raw from friction and neglect. Some even pierced their ears using a borrowed needle, wiped clean with spit or vinegar. When infections spread, they were dismissed as bad luck. In truth, it was poverty breeding both closeness and contamination. Despite the risks, the earring remained a treasured object. Women believed it drew attention to the face, framing the eyes and mouth in ways that made expression seem softer. A glimmer of metal against pale skin suggested grace, refinement, and maturity. The pain was hidden behind powder and smiles. Even when pus formed or scars hardened, the jewellery stayed on. To remove it was to break the illusion, to admit that beauty had consequences. The image of two women leaning close, sharing laughter and illness, captures the quiet contradictions of that world. What was meant to symbolize unity also reflected the fragility of their lives. Each small act of care, sharing earrings, exchanging ribbons, borrowing gloves, spread both warmth and danger. Friendship was tenderness wrapped around risk. There is something deeply moving about how women turned pain into ritual and ritual into love. In the end, the earring was never just an ornament. It was a bond, a memory, a tiny circle of metal linking one life to another. But as infections spread and stories of disfigurement grew, even that symbol of loyalty would begin to change. The need to connect would find new forms, ones that looked cleaner, yet carried dangers of their own, hidden beneath objects that touched not the ears, but the hair, where beauty itself could turn toxic. In many households of that era, a hair comb was more than an object of vanity. It was a relic of identity. Passed down from mother to daughter, it carried years of touch, scent, and silent memory. Women believed that every strand caught between its teeth held part of the self, and washing it away meant losing luck, charm, or even a piece of spirit. So they didn't. The same comb would glide through generations of hair, its fine teeth clogged with dust, oils, and fragments of skin. Yet it was cherished, kissed before travel, and placed under pillows for protection. It is strangely poetic and quietly revolting that what they considered sacred was layered with decay. The comb itself was often carved from bone, ivory, or tortoiseshell, materials that warmed quickly in the hand and retained the scent of the user. The fragrance of oil, perfume, and sweat soaked into it until it smelled unmistakably human. Each woman's comb had its own aroma, a mingling of hair powder, body heat, and years of use. To clean it would erase the very essence it carried. Many believed this lingering scent drew good fortune or affection, as though the smell of one's life could attract blessings. In some homes, combs were kept in embroidered pouches, tucked away like heirlooms. Dust collected between the teeth, but no one minded. It was said that the more a comb remembered, the luckier it became. Hair was a symbol of vitality, and caring for it was a daily ritual. Women brushed it hundreds of times each night, counting strokes in front of mirrors that reflected lamplight and fatigue. The comb moved slowly, separating tangles, spreading natural oil from root to tip. Each pass left residue, bits of dandruff, stray hairs, and traces of pomade. But these were seen as signs of prosperity, not filth. A glossy shine meant good health, even if it came from layers of build-up rather than cleanliness. Washing hair too often was discouraged. The oils that clung to it were believed to protect and nourish. The comb, never washed, became an extension of this philosophy, a faithful tool that knew the body better than any mirror. Perfumed oils made the ritual even more potent. Women massaged their scalps with mixtures of rose, almond, or castor oil, leaving a thick sheen behind. The scent lingered on the comb's bristles for weeks, blending with dust until the line between fragrance and rot disappeared. When the smell turned sour, they simply added more perfume, layering freshness on decay. Servants often complained of the residue, their fingers sticky from touching what no one dared scrub. But superstition held power. Cleaning a comb was said to wash away fortune, so it remained untouched, sacred in its grime. If this existed today, it would be like treasuring an unwashed brush for years and calling the smell of sweat a family heirloom. Mothers taught daughters how to care for their combs with reverence. The passing down of one was almost ceremonial, a moment of affection veiled in tradition. "This kept me beautiful," a mother might whisper, pressing the object into her child's palm. The gift carried expectations to preserve it, to use it gently, to believe in its unseen power. Daughters obeyed, combing their hair each night in the same rhythm their mothers had, the sound of bristles scraping through oil and dust blending into the quiet of domestic life. In this way, superstition became an inheritance. Among the upper classes, combs grew elaborate. Jewellers inlaid them with silver, coral, or carved initials. Yet the practice of not cleaning them remained the same. No matter how costly, a comb was never washed with soap or water. At most, a few loose hairs were pulled away. The build-up beneath was left untouched. Women stored these ornate objects in velvet boxes beside jewellery and keepsakes. Some believed the scent absorbed into the comb was part of their personal charm, something no other woman could replicate. It was not vanity but ritual, a small rebellion against the impersonal nature of the world outside. In poorer homes, combs were fewer but treated with equal devotion. Made of wood or bone, they wore down with time, their teeth splitting from use, yet even broken ones were kept, tied with a string, reused until useless. Dirt wedged between the teeth, and flakes of dried oil formed a dull film that glimmered faintly under light. To throw such an item away was unthinkable. A comb had memory. It had touched generations of heads, witnessed laughter, mourning, and silence. In a time when women had little that was truly their own, this object offered a sense of continuity. Doctors occasionally warned against this habit, linking unwashed combs to scalp infections, lice, and rashes. Their advice was largely ignored. Illness carried little fear compared to misfortune, and misfortune was believed to come from washing away personal scent. To smell like oneself, no matter how unpleasant, was to be protected. Cleanliness, paradoxically, was viewed as dangerous, an act that stripped away both identity and spirit. The contradiction was everywhere: obsession with appearance but avoidance of hygiene. A polished exterior hid the quiet rot beneath. Women took pride in their shining hair, not realizing that its glow was dimmed by build-up and residue. What mattered was how it looked in dim parlours, not how it felt in private. The comb remained both companion and culprit, feeding a cycle of care that was never truly clean. Something is haunting about the tenderness with which they guarded what slowly poisoned them. In bedrooms heavy with the scent of oil and fabric, combs rested on dressing tables like small monuments. Dust glimmered on their surfaces, the smell faintly sweet and strangely human. Each night the same sound returned, the slow drag of bristles through hair, the sigh of weariness, the preservation of routine. The comb gathered the day's remnants, adding another layer to its silent archive. Their devotion to these relics blurred the line between affection and superstition. The comb was not just a tool, it was memory made tangible, belief pressed into form, and as women ran it through their hair again and again, they unknowingly spread the past across the present, coating each strand with time itself. They brushed until the air thickened with oil and dust, until the scent of generations hung around them like invisible perfume. The object they cherished most was both heirloom and hazard, glimmering softly with inherited faith. When the hair lay smooth and heavy against their shoulders, they believed it held luck, but what lingered most was something darker, something that would not wash away. Among the many odd rituals of that age, few were as quietly revered as the use of fermented rice water for beauty. Women collected the cloudy liquid left after rinsing grains, storing it in glass jars that sat near windows where sunlight could gently warm it. Within days, the water turned sour, developing a faint film on the surface and a sharp, sweet smell that filled the air like overripe fruit. They believed this liquid held the secret to pale, smooth skin, the kind that marked refinement and gentility. To them, whiteness was virtue, and virtue could be washed into the face one handful at a time. It is hard not to smirk at the thought that the same water a servant might throw away became a lady's most prized potion. The practice began in kitchens, where rice was soaked and boiled daily. Rather than waste the leftover liquid, women poured it into bottles, letting it ferment naturally. The smell, at first mild, grew tangier with time, a sourness they described as earthly and seductive. Each morning, the cool liquid was splashed onto the face with cupped hands or applied with soft linen soaked overnight. The first touch was refreshing, even pleasant, but the residue left a faint stickiness that clung to the skin. The fermentation released bacteria invisible to the eye but potent enough to irritate even the most resilient complexion. Still, women continued, convinced that beauty required persistence and that purity could emerge from decay. Science, at the time, had little say in such matters. What women called tradition, doctors dismissed as nonsense. Yet even the skeptics could not deny the fashion for pale skin. Fairness was more than preference, it was status. To be white was to appear untouched by labour or sun. Working women darkened in the fields. Refined women stayed pale indoors, polishing their faces with whatever remedies promised brightness. Rice water, cheap and accessible, seemed like a gift from nature. Even its smell, sharp, fermented, and unmistakably human, became part of its charm. For the wealthy, the ritual took on refinement. Maids prepared bowls of fermented water infused with rose petals or orange peel to soften the odour. Women sat at their vanities in silence, patting the cool liquid onto their cheeks as if performing a sacred rite. The air grew thick with sour sweetness. Afterward, they dried their faces with embroidered towels, admiring the faint glow left behind. What they did not see were the invisible reactions, tiny inflammations beneath the skin, pores clogged by residue, and rashes forming along the jawline. When redness appeared, they called it healthy bloom. When peeling began, they said it was renewal. In their minds, pain was progress. If this existed today, it would be like rubbing spoiled milk on one's face and calling the stinging sensation proof of youth. In poorer homes, the ritual was simpler but no less devoted. Women reused the same jar of fermented water for days, sometimes weeks. Without refrigeration or care, the bacteria multiplied, flies gathered, the scent deepened, and mould formed along the rim. Yet the practice persisted. Even those who could not afford soap turned to rice water, believing it both cleansed and blessed the skin. It was said to draw out impurities, though no one could explain what that meant. Perhaps impurity was not of the body but of the soul, a vague fear made visible through blemishes and corrected through ritual. The results were unpredictable. Some women claimed their faces shone like porcelain, others developed painful rashes that spread across their necks. Yet in a world that prized endurance over comfort, they endured. Beauty manuals praised the method, describing it as a natural alternative to harsh powders or lead-based creams. The irony was sharp in trying to escape one form of poison. They found another, gentler in appearance but no less harmful. The faint odour that followed them became a whisper of their commitment, a sour halo of devotion that others politely ignored. Servants who handled the jars knew the truth. They scrubbed the containers once a week, pouring away the old water and replacing it with fresh batches. The dregs left behind smelled of rot and yeast. Some maids complained of burns on their hands from prolonged contact, but complaints held little power. Their mistresses expected results, not explanations. The servant's skin cracked, the lady's skin reddened. Both called it progress. As time passed, fermented rice water became a symbol of delicate femininity. The act of splashing one's face with something sour and unclean was transformed into a gesture of grace. The faint fermented aroma clung to collars and lace, following women through halls and parlours. Men described it as softly intoxicating, unaware of its source. The same liquid that spoiled rice in kitchens became perfume in drawing rooms, another proof that refinement was often just decay dressed in silk. There is something hauntingly beautiful in how people can turn the smell of rot into the scent of virtue. In portraits, their faces appear smooth and pale, glowing faintly beneath powdered foreheads. The texture seems flawless, but those who lived with them knew better. Behind the illusion of perfect skin lay tenderness, rawness, and the sting of nightly rituals repeated without question. The jars on their vanities, slightly crusted at the rim, stood as quiet witnesses to the lengths they went for beauty. Each morning, as the first light touched their mirrors, women dipped their fingers once more into the sour water, trusting it to renew them. The scent of fermentation mingled with powder and oil, creating an atmosphere both alluring and oppressive. What lingered on their skin was not just the residue of rice, but the weight of tradition, the belief that purity could only be earned through discomfort. Their faces glowed faintly, not with health, but with endurance, as if each drop of sour water washed away a piece of their youth. The liquid that promised beauty carried within it quiet decay, and they accepted it as grace. When the smell clung too long, they called it charm, never suspecting how close their rituals hovered to rot. They believed that a pleasant scent could redeem the body. When washing was rare and perfumes were costly, women turned to small fabric sachets filled with dried herbs and flowers to mask the odour that clung to them. These little pouches, sewn from silk or lace, were worn close to the skin, tucked inside corsets, pinned to undergarments, or tied beneath layers of heavy clothing. The mixture inside varied by household lavender for calmness, rosemary for virtue, rose petals for charm. Over time, the scent mixed with sweat, oil, and heat, creating something both sweet and sour, both floral and human. It is oddly poetic that what began as a gesture of grace ended up steeped in decay. The ritual of preparing these sachets was one of quiet devotion. Women sat at dressing tables surrounded by bowls of herbs, spooning handfuls into tiny bags before sealing them with ribbons. They believed that fragrance could protect the spirit as much as it could please the nose. In a world where water was distrusted and soap was seen as unnecessary, smell became the only form of cleanliness that mattered. The sachet offered a way to smell acceptable without ever truly being clean. For many, it was less an accessory than a necessity. To leave home without one was to risk embarrassment, a faint but undeniable mark of neglect. The heat beneath their gowns intensified the perfume, warming it until it became part of their natural scent. As the body moved, the fragrance pulsed outward in soft waves, mingling with the musk of skin. It was a false purity, a sweetness masking rot. Women often boasted that their scent lingered in rooms long after they had gone, unaware that it came as much from sweat as from lavender. Some carried several sachets at once, layering fragrance like armour. Beneath the illusion of elegance, the pouches slowly absorbed the body's moisture, darkening, softening, and eventually moulding where they touched the skin. If this existed today, it would be like wearing the same perfume-soaked cloth for months and calling it cleanliness. The materials inside were chosen not just for aroma but for meaning. Lavender symbolized modesty, rosemary faithfulness, thyme courage, and mint renewal. Women wore them as silent declarations of virtue, pressed against their flesh like whispered prayers. But time betrayed them. Within days, the herbs lost their sharpness, the flowers wilted, and dampness began its slow work. The mixture compacted into a dense, fragrant lump that clung to its pouch like wet soil. The lace discoloured, the silk stained. The perfume faded, replaced by something faintly sour. A sweetness turned stale. Still, few dared to replace them. Servants, whose duty it was to clean and maintain clothing, sometimes found the sachets when undressing their mistresses. They unpinned the small bundles, only to discover mould creeping through the seams. Some tore open to reveal blackened petals and damp powder, the remnants of beauty gone bad, yet even then, their mistresses demanded new ribbons, not new sachets. To wash or discard them was said to break the charm. The mould, unseen beneath the layers of fabric, became part of their femininity, a quiet rot that society mistook for grace. Doctors occasionally noted cases of skin irritation caused by these sachets. Rashes appeared along the chest and ribs where damp silk pressed too long against the body. The combination of moisture and warmth bred infection, but such complaints were rarely voiced. To acknowledge the problem was to admit the existence of odour, something a respectable woman could never do. It was better to itch than to smell, better to rot in perfume than to face the truth of sweat. In parlours and theatres, the air was heavy with overlapping fragrances, lavender from one dress, rose from another, all blending into a haze of artificial sweetness. The smell was suffocating, a perfumed fog that filled every corner of social life. To breathe in those gatherings was to taste the denial of an entire class. They did not smell clean, but they smelled expensive, and that was enough. Among the poor, similar sachets were made from scraps of fabric and dried weeds. Some used bread crusts soaked in oil, wrapped in cloth to mimic the luxury of perfume. These crude imitations smelled earthy and strong, more pungent than pleasant. But even here, the idea persisted that a woman's scent defined her worth. The difference lay only in ingredients, not in belief. Over time, these pouches took on symbolic power. Lovers exchanged them as tokens of affection, believing the fragrance carried the essence of the wearer. Mothers gave them to their daughters as blessings for marriage. They were buried with the dead, sewn into coffins to mask the smell of decay. Fragrance and death, intertwined from the beginning, found reconciliation in these little bags of rotting flowers. There is something deeply melancholic about how the desire to smell beautiful led them closer to the scent of death itself. The sachets remained close companions, pressed to the chest where hearts beat beneath layers of linen. Their fading scent became part of the woman who wore them, soft, warm, and slightly sour. Over time, no one could tell where the fragrance ended and the body began. The illusion of freshness lingered even as the air grew thick, perfumed with denial. Their perfume drifted through ballrooms and carriages, graceful but heavy, sweet but stale. The pouches they carried were no longer charms of purity, but small tombs of flowers long dead. As they held on to these rotting fragments of elegance, another custom was waiting to take hold, one that would move from scent to sweat itself, teaching women that even their own bodily moisture could be turned into virtue. Women of that era believed that the body's natural heat was its own kind of beauty. To sweat was not something to be hidden, but something to be preserved, a gift of the flesh that softened the skin and revealed vitality. Society taught that wiping it away would harm the complexion, that moisture kept the face supple and the body youthful. So after walking, dancing, or enduring long hours in corsets and layered gowns, many allowed the sweat to remain. Drops glistened along the neck, dampened linen undergarments, and darkened the seams of silk dresses. The scent rising from the skin was considered natural, even alluring. Astonishingly, what we now call odour was once thought to be the perfume of womanhood. Manuals on beauty and etiquette praised the glow of warm vitality. Perspiration, it was said, proved that the body's humours were balanced and its passions alive. Women were encouraged to glow delicately rather than cool themselves too quickly. Fans were moved not to stop sweat but to direct it, guiding the shimmer across the skin like a veil of moisture. Towels, when used, were dabbed lightly, just enough to keep the liquid from dripping. The residue that stayed behind gave the skin a sheen that powder could not replicate. To be dry, according to custom, was to be lifeless. Doctors of the time supported this strange conviction. Bathing too often, they warned, could close the pores, trapping illness inside. Perspiration was described as nature's cleansing, the body's way of renewal. The advice was followed faithfully. Instead of washing, many allowed sweat to evaporate, leaving faint salt crystals that mixed with perfume and powder. The combination produced a faint shimmer under candlelight, a sheen mistaken for radiance. Those who smelled it closely called it intimate, even intoxicating, the scent of life itself. None realized they were breathing in bacteria. Scent soon became identity. A faint musk was admired as the mark of authenticity, something that separated real women from artificial ones. Poets compared it to the fragrance of flowers after rain, soft and earthy. Writers spoke of living perfume, the scent of emotion and flesh entwined. Many women took pride in this idea, convinced that the warmth of their bodies expressed health and youth better than any cosmetic. It was a quiet rebellion against lifeless beauty, a return to something raw and physical. If this existed today, it would be like wearing the same unwashed gym clothes for a week and calling the smell confidence. Under the weight of heavy garments, the result was less romantic. Layers of fabric trapped heat and moisture, turning the skin into a damp, airless surface. Sweat pooled at the waist, between breasts, and along the back. The corset pressed it deeper, rubbing salt and fabric together until rashes formed. Even as irritation and odour grew, most women persisted. To complain was to appear fragile. To bathe too often was to seem immodest. Purity, once again, was defined by discomfort. The scent of perspiration mingled with herbs and oils from sachets, creating a complex odour, sweet at first, then pungent, like fruit beginning to spoil. Servants recognised the change immediately. The first days of warmth brought freshness, but by week's end, the smell turned heavy and sour. Washing the body might have solved it, but superstition held that removing natural oils would age the skin and drain its vitality. Many truly believed their sweat contained the essence of youth. Beauty guides of the time offered peculiar advice for maintaining the natural glow. Instead of bathing, they suggested brushing the skin with a dry cloth to redistribute moisture. It sounded scientific enough to comfort those who obeyed tradition. At night, women lay in rooms that smelled faintly sour, the air thick with perfume, fabric, and sweat. Bedsheets absorbed this scent like a second skin, steeped in a mixture of oil and exhaustion. The line between person and environment blurred until a woman's smell became the smell of her home. Men admired this scent without understanding it. Poems praised the living warmth of women, the fragrance of closeness that clung to lace and ribbon. They called it sincerity, never realizing it was the scent of bacteria thriving in silk. Illusion mattered more than truth. The odour of confinement was transformed into a symbol of passion. Women, in turn, learned to make it work for them, turning discomfort into intimacy and scent into allure. In the working class, the same belief took root but carried heavier consequences. Without perfume or luxury fabrics, sweat mixed with smoke, dirt, and fatigue. Washerwomen, cooks, and mill workers laboured in airless spaces, clothes soaked through, skin raw from salt and friction. They returned home to sleep in the same damp garments, waking to repeat the cycle. Cleanliness was not just impossible, it was considered unnecessary. Endurance became morality, as though survival itself were the ultimate virtue. The irony was merciless. A culture that worshipped softness created roughness, one that sought beauty through neglect. Skin glowed beneath layers of salt and fatigue, a false radiance mistaken for vitality. The scent filling parlours and bedrooms was neither sweet nor foul, only profoundly human. It was the smell of life contained, of warmth turned inward until it soured. There is something heartbreakingly honest about how the scent of exhaustion was once called grace. The body was left to breathe through sweat rather than through water, its moisture mistaken for youth, its odour for charm. What lingered on the skin was not purity, but perseverance. The quiet mark of women taught that endurance was elegance. As this belief faded slowly, another ritual began to take hold, one that replaced moisture with colour, teaching that pain itself could bloom across the skin as proof of beauty. The pursuit of colour was a quiet contradiction in that age. Women wanted skin pale enough to suggest purity, yet warm enough to look alive. They could not risk the vulgarity of sun or exercise, so they manufactured a blush by other means, through pain. Beauty manuals whispered of secret herbs that could revive the complexion, and among them, nettle and wormwood were most prized. Their leaves, when crushed and applied to the skin, caused a mild burning sensation. Within minutes, the surface reddened, and the dull, waxy complexion of powder came to life with a false bloom. Women called it awakening the blood. What they were really doing was summoning inflammation. It is both tragic and absurd that irritation was mistaken for vitality in a world terrified of real emotion. The ritual was almost tender in its cruelty. Women began by plucking the leaves with gloved hands, for direct contact caused itching and welts. The herbs were then bruised in small porcelain mortars until they released their sap, a pungent, bitter liquid that smelled faintly of earth and bitterness. This mixture was dabbed carefully onto the cheeks and chest, usually just before company arrived. The first touch was sharp, followed by warmth spreading beneath the skin. The redness appeared slowly, delicate and uneven, then deepened into the kind of flush that painters struggle to imitate. Beneath candlelight, it looked natural, even charming. No one could tell that the radiance was born from pain. The sensation lingered long after the evening ended. Skin tingled and burned for hours, sometimes swelling around the edges where the sap had been thickest. The next morning, fine blisters appeared, followed by peeling. Women described this as renewal, insisting that their skin looked smoother once it healed. Some added vinegar or lemon to strengthen the effect, creating mixtures so acidic that they stripped the outer layer entirely. The beauty that followed was fleeting, a few hours of glow for days of soreness. Yet the practice endured. Pain, after all, had long been a part of femininity's costume. For the wealthy, this ritual became almost artistic. In drawing rooms scented with rosewater, ladies experimented with different herbs, blending nettle with peppermint or thyme to alter the tone of the flush. Servants prepared the concoctions behind screens, grinding leaves with the precision of apothecaries. Small brushes made from feathers were used to paint the mixture on, stroke by stroke, as though applying rouge. But unlike rouge, this colour could not be wiped away. It had to fade naturally, or rather, heal. A woman who carried a faint warmth in her cheeks was said to have living beauty, a phrase that ignored the stinging beneath. If this existed today, it would be like burning one's skin with acid just to prove it still glows. Those who could not afford fresh herbs used stronger substitutes. Some rubbed their skin with nettle stems collected from roadsides, the tiny hairs of the plant pricking the flesh and releasing venom. Others used vinegar mixed with pepper, which caused swelling so intense that the eyes watered. In factories and kitchens, where women's skin dulled under soot and exhaustion, this ritual became a desperate luxury. Even the poor wanted to look alive, even if the colour came from harm. Beauty was pain refined into performance. Doctors, when consulted, spoke carefully. They warned that repeated irritation could cause scarring, that the herbs could inflame the blood vessels and lead to permanent redness. Yet their warnings were often buried beneath the praise of poets who admired cheeks kissed by nature. In truth, there was nothing natural about it. The flush that men adored was the body's cry for help, but in that era, suffering was elegance, and tenderness of skin was mistaken for moral delicacy. The chest, too, became a canvas for this practice. A soft red tint was considered sensual, a mark of health and refinement. Women dabbed the herb mixtures along their collarbones, allowing the sting to travel downward where fabric met flesh. The result was a faint rosiness that peeked through lace, suggesting warmth beneath restraint. When the skin blistered, they covered it with powder and called it modesty. No one questioned why grace required the body to burn. In private diaries, a few admitted the truth. They wrote of the itching that kept them awake, the heat that pulsed beneath their skin, the faint scars that formed beneath powder. Yet even these confessions carried pride. "It shows I am alive." One woman wrote, "Life, for her, meant proof of sensation, even if that proof came from suffering." The red marks were not just on the skin, but in the mind, evidence that she still felt something in a world that demanded silence. Perfume and fashion reinforced the illusion. Rouge could be smudged, but a flush born of pain could not. It lasted longer, looked more sincere. The same society that condemned artificiality prized authenticity that came from torment. This was the paradox at the heart of beauty to appear effortless. A woman had to work harder, hurt deeper, and hide better. The herbs merely made visible what culture already demanded, that femininity must suffer quietly and gracefully. There is something profoundly sad about how women were taught to bloom through agony, as if pain were their most honest colour. Over time, some women developed chronic skin conditions. Their cheeks stayed red even without the herbs, capillaries bursting beneath thin flesh. The glow that once drew admiration became permanent blotches. Still, Others envied them for it, whispering that their colour was natural. In a way, it was nature claiming back what artifice had destroyed. The cycle repeated endlessly: irritation, redness, concealment, pride. The face became both battlefield and mask. The poorest women took shortcuts, using crushed insects or spices to simulate the same irritation. Paprika, cinnamon, even powdered brick, all produced the same fleeting flush. The scent of spice on skin mingled with sweat, creating an illusion of vitality that was as temporary as it was intoxicating. For a few hours, they looked alive. By morning, the illusion cracked, leaving only rawness and regret. The fascination with red skin endured because it symbolized life in a world obsessed with restraint. Paleness meant obedience, but a faint blush suggested spirit, a dangerous balance between control and passion. Women learned to walk that line, painting their bodies with pain that passed for charm. The warmth on their cheeks hid the coldness of a culture that prized appearance above all else. Faces glowed beneath the candlelight, radiant and trembling, every flush a quiet disguise for endurance. The warmth that spread across the cheeks was not passion but persistence, a beauty stitched from ache and expectation. When that fleeting colour faded, another ritual awaited, one that would cleanse not with fire, but with salt, cutting far deeper than the skin itself. Among the many rituals of cleanliness, few were as quietly brutal as the daily washing with salt water. Women believed that purity could be preserved through pain, that the sting of salt meant the body was being cleansed of sin. The practice was passed down like a whispered inheritance, taught by mothers to daughters as a private duty rather than a choice. Buckets of warm water were mixed with handfuls of coarse salt, the crystals dissolving into a cloudy solution that promised protection. In small basins behind closed doors, women bent over the water, trusting that the sharp burn that followed was proof of virtue. It is almost unbearable to think that what they called purity was, in truth, self-inflicted punishment disguised as hygiene. The logic behind it came from both superstition and ignorance. Salt had long been used to preserve food, to stop rot, and to heal wounds. Its power to dry and tighten flesh was seen as proof of its sanctity. Medical pamphlets and household guides praised it as a simple disinfectant, safe and natural. No one questioned that the skin it touched was far more delicate than what it was meant to clean. Women were told that to endure the sting was to show restraint and self-control. Pain became reassurance. A burning sensation was proof that the ritual worked. Those who felt nothing were told to add more salt. The process itself was methodical. Basins were set on the floor near fireplaces or under candlelight. Women poured hot water and stirred until the crystals vanished. Steam rose with the faint scent of minerals, sharp and sterile. Then came silence, only the sound of water moving and the faint hiss of breath when the liquid touched skin. It was not a bath of comfort, but of endurance. The salt dried the flesh, stripped away natural oils, and left the surface raw. Afterward, women stood motionless, shivering, waiting for the burning to subside. They often described a sense of tightness, which they mistook for cleanliness. For some, it became a daily ritual. They believed the water closed the body, guarding chastity and preventing disease. Others used it after menstruation, childbirth, or intimacy, thinking it purified them from impurity. The pain was personal but collective. Nearly every woman of the time knew the sting. If this existed today, it would be like scrubbing one's skin with bleach and calling the chemical burn a form of self-care. The difference was only that their world saw the suffering as necessary, even noble. The consequences were slow but devastating. Constant exposure to salt destroyed the natural balance of the body. The skin cracked, small wounds formed, and infection often followed. Many women developed chronic irritation, yet they did not connect it to the cause. Doctors rarely spoke of such matters openly. It was indecent to discuss female discomfort. Instead, they prescribed more rinsing, more cleaning, reinforcing the very harm they should have prevented, the belief that a woman must always smell of nothing, that her purity depended on absence, fed the cycle of damage. For poorer families, salt was easy to find. It was cheap, stored in sacks beside flour and coal. Housewives prepared their mixtures quietly, while husbands and children slept. The act was done not for pleasure but out of fear of gossip, of illness, of being seen as unclean. Women carried that fear in silence, measuring virtue in granules of pain. Their world gave them no other tools, no language to name the damage, only the command to remain pure. Among the wealthy, the same ritual took on a different form. Perfumed salts were sold in elegant tins, promising refinement and protection. They were advertised in ladies' journals as restorative tonics, often mixed with alum or borax for a stronger effect. The packaging was beautiful, the purpose cruel. Even in luxury, the principle remained unchanged. Cleanliness meant control, and control meant pain. Behind lace curtains and marble basins, the same sting was endured, only hidden beneath a veneer of sophistication. Over time, the effects became visible. The skin lost its softness, dryness turned to fissures, and infections deepened. Some women could no longer sit comfortably, yet they persisted, convinced that discomfort was the cost of respectability. The line between hygiene and punishment blurred until they became the same. Pain was not an accident. It was the ritual itself. Science, when it finally spoke, did so timidly. A few physicians began to question the use of salt, noting its corrosive effects. But their warnings were drowned by moral voices insisting that discipline of the body preserved discipline of the soul. It was easier to accept the myth than to admit harm. The Church, too, quietly endorsed the habit, praising women who guarded their virtue through purity and restraint. The result was generations of women who cleansed themselves into discomfort, carrying the quiet ache of piety in their flesh. There was also an emotional weight to the ritual. Many women described feeling renewed afterward, not because they were clean, but because the pain itself brought a strange sense of peace. The sting confirmed that they had done their duty, that they had erased whatever invisible guilt might have clung to them. In a world that linked womanhood with sin, pain was a form of prayer. The salt burned away not only the body's softness but its confidence, teaching women to mistrust the very sensations that made them human. In private, some tried gentler methods. They diluted the water, added rose petals, or replaced salt with milk. But guilt followed softness. The absence of sting made them uneasy, as if comfort itself were sinful. So they returned to the harsher version, each repetition tightening the chain of custom. No matter how enlightened their age claimed to be, the oldest superstition still ruled, the belief that a woman's worth was measured by how well she endured. It is haunting to imagine that pain, for them, was the purest proof of discipline. The ritual of salt reflected everything that society expected from women: restraint, silence, and obedience dressed as cleanliness. The water cooled, the burn faded, but the lesson stayed. Purity required pain. In the same way that corsets shaped the body and cosmetics reshaped the face, this ritual shaped the flesh itself, turning discomfort into devotion. What began as hygiene became a quiet submission to suffering, one that would prepare them for yet another ritual of control, this time hidden not in the bath but beneath layers of fabric and the false promise of fragrance. Among the strangest remedies to survive in that era was the belief that animal urine could cure blemishes. In a world without reliable medicine, desperation turned superstition into skincare. Women whispered of its power, claiming that goat's urine, in particular, had the strength to cleanse the skin and erase imperfections. The idea spread through back alleys and drawing rooms alike, from farmyards to parlours, until the smell of ammonia became the scent of misguided hope. It was a practice born from equal parts poverty and trust, and it lingered because it promised what no powder or lotion could: a cure for shame itself. It is both tragic and grotesque that women once touched their faces with urine and called it grace. Each night, the ritual began in quiet secrecy. Some collected the liquid directly from animals, believing freshness mattered. Others purchased it from vendors who claimed to distill it for purity. The process was simple but humiliating. A small cloth or cotton ball was soaked in the warm liquid and dabbed gently over the cheeks, chin, and forehead. The sharp scent filled the room, strong enough to sting the eyes, yet they endured it in silence. The first contact burned faintly, leaving behind a tingling sensation that was mistaken for healing. By morning, the skin felt tight and dry, the redness slightly reduced, but the smell clung stubbornly to the flesh. The logic behind this strange practice came from early medical beliefs. Urine, especially from healthy animals, was thought to be antiseptic. Physicians in old herbal guides described it as cleansing to the humours, a fluid that could draw out impurities from the body. The same reasoning that made it useful for washing wounds now found its way to the vanity table. Goat's urine was favoured because of its mildness, though mild was a generous word. It carried a bitter, acrid scent that no amount of rosewater could disguise. Women tried to mask it with perfume, creating a nauseating mixture of sweetness and decay. For poorer families, the appeal was obvious. Cosmetics were expensive, physicians unreachable, and spots on the skin could ruin a woman's prospects. A pitted face suggested neglect, and neglect was unforgivable. Goat's urine, by contrast, was free and plentiful. Housewives gathered it in jars, storing it near the window to keep it from spoiling. The irony was cruel. What they used to scrub floors and bleach fabric was now pressed against their own skin. If this happened today, it would be like someone rubbing household cleaner on their face and calling it natural skincare. Some believed that the smell was part of its power. They said the stench drove away impurities, that suffering through it proved dedication. The more pungent the odour, the stronger the result. Others believed that urine carried the vitality of the animal itself, that goats, nimble, hardy, and stubborn, passed on their resilience to those who used their essence. It was a kind of spiritual osmosis, a merging of body and myth. Yet behind the faith was simple desperation. The fear of imperfection was stronger than disgust. In wealthy households, the ritual was cloaked in refinement. Servants prepared the tonic in small glass bottles labelled with delicate handwriting. The ladies applied it behind closed doors, afterward covering their faces with layers of powder and floral oils. At parties, no one mentioned the faint sourness that sometimes drifted beneath the perfume. Etiquette forbade such honesty. A polite smile could hide the knowledge that nearly every woman in the room had rubbed some form of waste upon her cheeks that morning. The results, predictably, were mixed. Some claimed clearer skin after weeks of use, though what they mistook for healing was often dehydration. The urine's ammonia stripped away oil, drying the surface so that blemishes temporarily flattened, but beneath, irritation grew, skin cracked, pores inflamed, and infections worsened. Doctors who encountered these cases blamed female vanity, not the practice itself. They treated the wounds, but never questioned why women felt compelled to suffer them. The problem, in their view, was not the cure, it was the women. There were even more extreme variations. Some added ashes or vinegar to strengthen the mixture, believing it would purify faster. Others used the urine of young boys, claiming innocence enhanced its potency. The line between ritual and absurdity blurred entirely. In the candlelight of narrow rooms, women pressed their faces with cloth soaked in animal waste, convincing themselves they were cleansing the soul through the skin. The silence surrounding these acts was deafening. No one laughed because no one dared to admit how far dignity had fallen in the name of beauty. Over time, the smell itself became a mark of sincerity. If a woman's perfume failed to cover the trace of ammonia, it was assumed she was serious about her complexion. Those who refused the practice were mocked as lazy or proud. Shame replaced reason. To belong, one had to smell of purity, even if that purity came from filth. The social pressure was immense. Mothers taught their daughters, insisting that natural meant painful, that good skin required sacrifice. The word clean lost all meaning when what cleansed also corrupted. Historians now view this as one of many examples of how ignorance and desperation entwined. The same culture that celebrated refinement built its rituals upon decay. In a society obsessed with appearances, even waste found purpose. Women who endured the stench and sting were not foolish. They were trapped. They believed what the world told them, that beauty excused everything, even degradation. It's difficult not to feel sympathy for them, knowing they fought invisible battles against their own reflection. As the centuries passed, the practice faded. Modern science replaced superstition, though echoes remain in the endless search for natural cures. The idea that suffering makes beauty more real still lingers quietly in creams, masks, and treatments that promise miracles at the cost of comfort. The past has not vanished, it merely changed its scent. The act of smearing such a mixture across one's face was both ritual and rebellion, a silent attempt to control what life had stolen. Yet the cost was humiliation disguised as devotion. When the jar emptied, the skin burned, and the smell refused to leave. Only one truth remained: beauty, when built upon misery, always rots beneath the surface. Soon, another ritual would rise to hide that decay, one that cloaked the body in dust and ashes while calling it refinement. Of all the peculiar rituals used to construct the illusion of elegance, few are as hauntingly primitive as painting the face with dust and ashes. The powders of that age were not refined creations of luxury, but remnants of what had been burned, scraped from hearths, and mixed with animal fat. It was beauty crafted from residue, grace built upon destruction. Women believed that this dark mixture softened their features, giving them a mysterious, introspective glow that suggested depth of feeling. The dim shimmer of grey on their faces was meant to convey refinement, but in truth, it was the quiet art of masking decay. It is haunting to realize that the ashes of fire were once seen as the marks of sophistication. The preparation was simple, and that simplicity made it universal. In narrow kitchens and smoky rooms, women sifted ashes through cloth until they became a soft grey powder. They mixed it with melted lard or tallow, stirring until a sticky paste formed. The mixture smelled faintly of smoke and grease, cool under the fingertips but heavy once spread across the skin. Some added soot from lamps to deepen the tone, and others used garden soil for warmth. When the paste was pressed over the face, it dulled the shine, creating a muted softness. Under candlelight, it caught the light just enough to suggest smoothness, though the skin beneath often burned with irritation. Each application was deliberate, performed before mirrors that reflected both vanity and exhaustion. Women brushed the mixture along their brows, eyes, and cheeks, blending until their features blurred. The result was neither pale nor dark, but suspended somewhere in between, a face softened into shadow. This muted beauty was praised as intelligent, a word that meant quiet, controlled, unreadable. To look alive was bold, to look subdued was graceful. The ashes turned faces into small monuments of restraint. The fashion spread not because of luxury, but because of poverty. Imported powders from Paris or London were too costly for most, while soot and dirt could be gathered freely. A few ashes from the fireplace could mimic the subtle tones worn by women of status. It was imitation disguised as philosophy. If it happened today, it would be like rubbing chimney soot on the face and calling it minimalist makeup. The meaning, however, went deeper than appearance. Ash carried symbolism, humility, mourning, and introspection. To be beautiful was not enough. One had to seem wounded. The grey shadows implied emotional depth, and society adored that illusion. Women who appeared pale and faded were said to have the soul of poets. A flushed, healthy complexion suggested vulgarity. It was elegance through erasure. The less alive one looked, the more spiritual she appeared. But what gave softness to the eye gave sickness to the skin. The ashes contained traces of lead, resin, and soot, all toxic. The oils used to bind them sealed the pores, trapping heat beneath the surface. Many developed rashes or swelling, but few dared to abandon the ritual. Pain was the price of acceptance, and vanity was rarely mistaken for rebellion. The very smoke that filled their homes now coated their faces, turning daily survival into decoration. In wealthier homes, the practice was refined. Ashes were perfumed, packaged in tiny silver tins, and sold under names like ethereal dust. Servants prepared the mixtures, grinding and straining until the texture resembled velvet. Some women mixed in fine clays or oils from olives and almonds, pretending sophistication could make the substance clean. Still, the principle remained the same. What once symbolized filth had become a badge of refinement. To appear shadowed was to appear wise. The look was admired in portraits and poetry alike. Artists painted women with muted tones, capturing the way lamplight touched their grey-tinted cheeks. Writers described their eyes as smoke beneath glass. What no one admitted was that these effects were literal. The air they breathed and the paint they wore came from the same soot. The line between art and poison had vanished completely. Even as new powders arrived, scented, imported, and pure, the habit lingered. Old routines die slowly when they serve as comfort. Many women continue to darken their features out of habit, as if afraid that without the ashes, their faces would reveal too much life. In that dim, grey elegance, they found protection. To be dull was to be invisible, and invisibility was safety in a world that judged harshly. There was something almost poetic in their persistence. The ashes they wore were both the remnants of their homes and symbols of their silence. Each layer represented survival, adaptation, resignation. They could not control the fire, but they could control what it left behind. In that act, they turned destruction into disguise. It is difficult not to feel a strange admiration for how they found beauty in what had already died. As years passed, the ashes disappeared, replaced by powders that claimed purity. Yet the logic remained unchanged. Beauty meant concealment, and suffering was the price of grace. What began as the soot of survival became the dust of conformity. The faces that once glowed softly beneath a veil of grey were gone, but the silence they represented still lingers in every ritual that tells women to be less visible, to be seen as refined. The dim shimmer of ash once suggested depth, but beneath its surface was the same story repeated through centuries: pain, patience, and the quiet erasure of the self in the name of grace. When the fire burned out and only residue remained, the women turned it into art, convincing the world that the marks of ruin were the signs of virtue. The illusion would not last forever, but before it faded, another rule would rise, one that made even the act of breathing seem impure, forcing elegance to begin where cleanliness was forbidden. Cleanliness, in that age, was a matter of illusion, and nowhere was that illusion more peculiar than in the mouths of women who refused to brush their teeth. To scrape away the yellow film or rinse away the residue of meals was seen not as refinement, but as excess. The belief spread quietly that brushing too often would erode the enamel, that the natural layer of film was a protective veil. Instead, women polished their teeth with soft cloths, rubbed herbs against their gums, or simply rinsed with water infused with mint leaves. It was not meant to whiten, but to refresh gently, to keep what they called a natural scent. Astonishingly, what they called nature was, in truth, the slow surrender to decay. The routine was unhurried, almost graceful in its neglect. A lady might sit by her vanity, dip a linen cloth into rose water, and wipe the front of her teeth as though tending to fine porcelain. She would then chew a sprig of thyme, sage, or lavender, believing it would sweeten the breath from within. Toothbrushes did exist, but they were objects of suspicion, harsh, foreign, and mechanical. Many thought the stiff bristles would scrape the enamel raw, leaving the teeth dull and weak. Doctors of the time even warned against excessive friction, reinforcing the superstition. What remained was a ritual of gentleness that led, over time, to rot. The logic was consistent with the age's ideals. Cleanliness was important, but so was restraint. To scrub too vigorously, to chase sterility, seemed vulgar. True ladies were not meant to smell like soap or mint. They were to carry a trace of life, subtle, imperfect, human. The faint musk of the body, the soft scent of breath, were considered personal marks. A polished mouth smelled unnatural, almost deceitful. Modesty extended even to the mouth. Anything too clean looked suspiciously modern. If one were to imagine it today, it would be like praising bad breath as a mark of authenticity. Yet even this restraint had its rituals. Herbalists sold bundles of dried leaves tied with string, called breath bouquets. Women carried them in their reticules, pressing them between their teeth before social calls. Some used powdered charcoal, rubbing it along their gums for its supposed whitening effect, though the grainy texture often scratched the enamel they meant to protect. Others chewed cloves, not for freshness, but to signal refinement, their bitterness proof of discipline. The goal was not cleanliness, but balance to appear untouched by vanity, while still vaguely pleasant. The irony was cruel. Beneath those faint perfumes of herbs, decay quietly bloomed. Without brushing, food lodges between teeth, turning the mouth into a slow furnace of fermentation. Breath turned sour, gums receded, and infections spread. Yet these changes were gradual, invisible enough to ignore. The mirrors of that age showed faces, not mouths. The rot was hidden behind lips trained to smile gracefully. The pain dismissed as a small price for gentility. To suffer silently was, after all, the hallmark of femininity. Men's standards reinforced the myth. Poets wrote of women whose breath carried the warmth of life, whose mouths spoke with the fragrance of truth. The words were meant as flattery, but they celebrated neglect. A faintly sour breath, mixed with the sweetness of perfume, became part of a lady's aura, natural, intimate, mortal. In polite society, mentioning hygiene at all was indelicate. So the fiction endured to smell slightly of the body was to be real. Only courtesans, it was whispered, used strong scents or powders to mask their breath. Respectable women carried theirs unaltered. Inside the home, the ritual of restraint continued. Toothbrushes, when present, were tucked away like shameful instruments. Mothers warned daughters not to over-polish their smiles, insisting that frequent brushing thinned the enamel and aged the face. To chew herbs and smile modestly was safer. The tongue, left uncleaned, developed a constant bitterness that became part of daily life. Even illness did not change the habit. Bleeding gums were blamed on sensitive constitutions, not neglect. Suffering remained the quiet proof of purity. For the poor, the logic took on a harsher form. Tooth powder was expensive, brushes rare, and soap too valuable for mouths. A rag dipped in vinegar or salt water served as the only tool. Those who worked in factories or kitchens often wiped their teeth with soot to mimic polish, believing the blackness would absorb bad smells. In dim candlelight, no one noticed the stains, only the faint shimmer of lips that smiled through discomfort. Among the wealthy, neglect was masked by luxury. Perfumed lozenges, made from honey and crushed herbs, circulated at parties. Women sucked them discreetly, convinced they purified the mouth. The lozenges, however, were made with chalk and sugar substitutes that did little but feed the bacteria they were meant to suppress. What was called refinement was, again, just rotting wearing perfume. The result, over the years, was a kind of collective decay that no one dared acknowledge. Mouths became the quiet testament to an age obsessed with appearances but fearful of touch. The same women who polished their skin with poisons and shaped their bodies with corsets now let their mouths crumble, because even the act of caring too much was seen as vulgar. The odour of the past was not only in the air but in every word spoken, every whispered greeting scented faintly with resignation. It is unsettling to imagine conversations that carried both sweetness and the sour trace of slow ruin. As science advanced, the myths began to crumble. Dentists warned of infection, doctors spoke of hygiene, and a new age of cleanliness began. But the fear of excess never disappeared. Even now, the ideal of natural beauty whispers the same message, that gentleness, even to the point of neglect, is virtue. What began as the superstition of restraint still lingers quietly in the corners of modern vanity. The gentle neglect of the mouth revealed more than decay. It exposed a belief that cleanliness must never outshine modesty. Beneath the calm smiles and herbal scents lay centuries of hesitation, a fear that to care too much for the body was to lose one's soul. When that illusion finally cracked, it gave birth to a new obsession, where fragrance and artifice would no longer hide decay but define it entirely, making beauty itself a performance of control and excess. The illusion of perfection often lingers longest in the residue it leaves behind. Women of that era learned to wear their beauty not as colour, but as accumulation. Each layer of powder, oil, and pigment clung to the skin for days, creating a mask that blurred the line between elegance and decay. Washing it away was considered wasteful, even dangerous. The face, once painted, was to remain untouched, preserved like porcelain, protected from exposure. What began as convenience turned into custom, and custom hardened into pride. It is almost poetic that the very thing meant to beautify the skin became the reason it could no longer breathe. Each morning, the mirror revealed not renewal but endurance. The same powder that was applied days before now sat unevenly upon the face, mixed with the oils and sweat of sleep. The rouge deepened into darker shades. The once smooth texture of the skin hardened beneath its crust. Yet, to the dim glow of candlelight, the illusion still shimmered faintly. The skin appeared calm and unchanging, as though time had been gently brushed away. Women added more pigment on top of the old, sealing fatigue and dust beneath another layer of false youth. They called it preservation, but it was merely concealment. What looked flawless was, in truth, the careful burial of life beneath ritual. The tools of this endurance were simple: cloths, sponges, jars of oil, and brushes worn stiff with residue. These objects absorbed fragments of the past, carrying yesterday's powder into today's application. The faint smell of talc and perfume hung in the air, mingling with the musty scent of sweat and oil. The face became a diary written in dust, its pages turned with each passing day but never erased. Lasting beauty, they called it, beauty that endured not because it was alive, but because it refused to die. If such a practice existed today, it would be like wearing the same makeup for weeks and calling it timeless elegance. Admiration from society made the custom stronger. At dinners, balls, and quiet gatherings, women whose makeup never faded were praised for refinement. Guests whispered of their grace, their serenity, their porcelain complexion. Few understood that beneath that stillness lay suffocation. The women smiled politely, knowing that to reveal the truth, the grime, the sweat, the discomfort, would be to break the illusion. To cleanse was to confess, to show that beauty required effort, and effort, in their world, was unfeminine. A lady was expected to appear as though time could not touch her, as though her face existed beyond the decay of flesh. In wealthy households, this habit became a performance of perfection. Servants stood silently with brushes and cloths, retouching yesterday's paint instead of removing it. New layers were added, perfumes misted, cheeks powdered, lips redefined. The old residue softened into the new, forming a patina that disguised the living face beneath. Under candlelight, this created a soft, ethereal glow, the illusion of eternal youth. In daylight, however, it cracked like old plaster. The women themselves rarely looked too closely. Mirrors in their homes were often blurred or dim, flattering their reflection by hiding its truth. The poor, too, followed the same ritual in simpler form. Without servants or fine powders, they relied on soot, flour, and cheap rouge. Washing was impractical when water was scarce and soap expensive. Layers of grime and colour merged until one could not be separated from the other. To the eye, their faces seemed painted, though the pigment was half dirt, half dream. But even for them, the rule was the same: what remained was stronger than what was lost. Beauty, like survival, depended on endurance. Behind the praise of a lasting beauty was a deeper fear, the fear of exposure. To wash the face was to see oneself plainly, stripped of colour and disguise. That nakedness carried the weight of shame. Women had been taught to present calmness, modesty, and control. Anything too vivid or raw was seen as vulgar. The painted mask became both protection and prison. Beneath it, emotions could flicker without being noticed. Exhaustion could hide beneath stillness. The face no longer belonged to the woman. It belonged to the world that demanded it remain lovely. Doctors eventually began to object. They spoke of clogged pores, inflamed eyes, and premature aging caused by powders that trapped dirt and oil. Reformers urged cleansing, calling it moral as well as medical. Hygiene became a new religion, promising redemption through water. But old habits resisted easily. Women who had spent decades perfecting stillness could not bear the vulnerability of a bare face. Cleanliness felt like exposure, and exposure felt like failure. So, even as soap and lotions filled the markets, the old rituals persisted behind closed doors. The irony of their devotion was profound. The very society that glorified purity also condemned women for taking care of themselves. A clean, bare face looked common, while a powdered one suggested refinement. The contradiction was impossible to escape. Women were told to be natural but not ordinary, beautiful but not vain, visible but not bold. The unwashed face, still painted, still polished, was their solution. It satisfied the expectation of beauty while hiding the reality of effort. In this, they found both dignity and despair. It feels strangely tender to imagine them sleeping with their faces still painted, believing that what lasted longest was what mattered most. Over time, the build-up of powder turned to residue to ruin. Some women developed rashes that spread across their cheeks. Others lost their lashes to wax hardened by nights of sleep. Still, they endured, whispering that the pain proved the quality of the product, that true elegance demanded patience. When they finally washed, days later, the water in the basin turned cloudy with the remains of powder and perfume, a small, grey ocean of all they had carried. The clean skin beneath looked foreign, unfamiliar, almost indecent. The mirror reflected not youth, but age waiting beneath the paint. Reformers called for a return to natural beauty, and yet even this was another form of control. Women were urged to look fresh but never too bare, polished but never false. The same society that once rewarded stillness now demanded constant renewal. In the end, little changed. The corsets loosened, the powders lightened, but the expectations remained. The face was still a battlefield of perception, caught between the truth of flesh and the fantasy of grace. The story of beauty, From poisonous powders to perfumed ashes, from corsets to unwashed faces, was never truly about attraction. It was about discipline, about the quiet endurance demanded of women in exchange for approval. Every sting of lead, every cracked lip, every clogged pore told the same story, that perfection was not a gift but a wound carefully polished. The beauty that refused to fade was not vanity. It was survival written in powder and pain. As the lights of those candlelit rooms dim in memory, one can almost imagine the faint outlines of those painted faces resting in the dark. The scent of rosewater, powder, and time lingers like a sigh. They are gone, yet their rituals remain, disguised in creams, sprays, and promises that whisper the same message that to endure is to be beautiful. Beneath every modern gloss still breathes the ghost of that endurance, waiting to be seen. And now, as we close the mirror on that long painted age, let your thoughts rest gently on the dust of history. Let the echoes of powder and perfume fade into silence. You have heard their whispers, their pain, their quiet grace. Let them rest. The night is soft, and time no longer demands perfection. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the weight of beauty dissolve into calm. Sleep well, and dream not of appearance, but of peace. Good night.